Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Before the video starts, I'd like to raise awareness on a friend's GoFundMe. Her family restaurant has been going through some difficult patches lately, and they've been feeling really stressed out over the whole thing. The goal is to reach $10,000, which I know is a lot, but I know Jar can get a big audience to see his videos from time to time. If at least 10,000 people were to watch this video and each of them donated just $1, that would definitely help them reach their goal. I'm not asking for much, just to give a moment of your time to check it out. If you can't donate, try spreading it around however you can. Any form of help would be deeply appreciated. Thank you. When you think of horror, what's the first thing you think of? Zombies? Aliens? Killers dressed in a costume while wearing a mask? Ghosts? Spirits of the dead? All these things sound scary, and they can be under the right circumstances. But there's something even more disturbing and scary than all these things. And that comes in the form of personal demons. Sometimes the evil inside of ourselves is more terrifying than any outside source, paving a way into the most disturbed elements of the human mind. This is what many refer to as psychological horror, which I always found to be more fascinating than other types of horror. It creates a greater sense of tension and unpredictability, as it's nearly impossible to interpret what's going on in a person's head. Sometimes the scariest and most unnerving thing of all is the demented psyche of the characters who've had their minds twisted in ways that the human mind can barely process. It can catch you off guard beyond any cheap jump scares or loud bursts of music. It's a form of horror that's more subtle, relying on atmosphere, delivery, pacing, and emotion rather than dark environments or supernatural monsters. And while there are psychological horror stories that implement these elements, they never take away from what's truly meant to be the terror of the story: the human mind. It's a form of horror so unsettling that not even the heroes we're meant to empathize with are safe from it. No amount of plot armor can protect them from it, especially when they turn out to be just as insane as the villains or other obstacles they encounter. A hero who ends up being a killer or someone with deep-seated trauma that warps their perception of reality. Can we still find it in ourselves to root for them after finding out about their sinister nature? This is a question asked of us by Silent Hill 2. I know, it's really dumb of me to try and break down this game in 2024 when so many people have already analyzed and broken it up already. This game needs no introduction. What can I possibly say about it that hasn't already been said by thousands, maybe millions of people? Why even bother making a video about it? Well, because unlike everyone else, I never played this game until recently. I joked in the past about how ridiculous it was to try and buy a copy of this game because of the ridiculous pricing people would put it up for, particularly in my old review of the original Dead Space. But after saving enough money and swallowing my pride, my curiosity got the best of me, especially with a certain remake on the horizon. I blew $200 on this game, and I have to say, it was worth every penny. In the short amount of time it's been in my possession, Silent Hill 2 has become one of my favorite video games of all time. It surpassed Dead Space as my favorite survival horror game, and that includes the already excellent remake. Everything about it is survival horror perfection. The story, pacing, atmosphere, gameplay elements, acting, sound design, music, and the multiple endings that determine James' ultimate fate. Even the tank controls that I've criticized other games for manages to perfectly fit into the setting this game creates. I was so deeply enthralled in this game that I forgot I was even playing a video game half the time. And that gives me the motivation to delve into it, to better understand what its upcoming remake is up against. Even knowing about its reputation as the holy grail of survival horror, I still wasn't prepared for how good it was going to be. It all starts with that first image of James looking into the mirror of a rest stop just outside the haunted town. With a single facial expression and a single gesture with his hand, we end up feeling a strange and mysterious aura emitting from James Sunderland. This is our first time seeing him, yet despite this we instantly feel a connection with him. This game was developed from 1999 to 2001 before its release, and yet this shot of James staring himself in the mirror resonates so strongly for its realism. The look on his face and the way his eyes focus on his reflection are very subtle and subdued with a proper lack of emotion, foreshadowing the ultimate revelation very early on. James' lack of emotion and sense of absence from his reality shows how affected he is by the passing of his wife. It feeds us hints of his dilemma while not giving anything away, demonstrating how blind he is by his pain without showing it. It's also worth noting that the gesture James does with his hand is a common dream technique, one used by people to see if they're awake. James is in awe of what he's going through at the moment, so much that it doesn't feel real to him. The idea that his late wife Mary is somehow still alive, waiting for him in Silent Hill. It feels like a dream that's too good to be true. and yet he wants it to be real as it gives him hope, something to hold on to after his world fell apart. Without any context from the story, you would have no idea what it means, but as you progress through the rest of the game, it ends up meaning a lot of things depending on how you interpret it. James could be checking his sanity, or having a flash of memories while contemplating Mary's letter, or judging himself in his mind after realizing what he did before seeing the letter, or seeing if he's still the same person after Mary's death, or maybe trying to hold on to the hope that she's still alive despite the reality of her being gone. And it's made even better by the dreamlike atmosphere the opening creates, the soft, welcoming music blending with the natural dialogue, the ambience of the abandoned bathroom transitioning to a quiet, foggy parking lot. It feels really peaceful and comforting, and gives you a moment of consolation to ease you into the game's world. As you take control of James and walk outside, you're met with a simple panning out shot, with James standing out on the overpass while thinking about Mary's letter. As he remembers her words, we listen to Mary recalling memories of the town and the unfulfilled promise of James taking her back there. And the way she talks about it has a really subtle and sad tone, like she's been through this problem before and her promise was rejected multiple times. And it's made even more disheartening by the way James recalls the event. While talking about the letter, he takes a short pause to pronounce Mary, showing how the sheer memory of his wife hurts him. As he recalls his last memories of her, we get a simple wide shot of the parking lot and James staring out at the lake. There's no overly dramatic cinematography here, just a simple overview of the setting. The way he reflects on these memories feels like he's disassociating himself from reality in the same way he repressed the memory of his wife, asking himself if what he's about to do is real or a dream. The entire opening sequence, from the mirror to Mary's letter to James' inner monologue, is one of the greatest opening sequences to a video game I've ever seen. It's an introduction that wastes no time. No unnecessary flashbacks, just immediately starting James' journey and establishing his motivations. It's not trying to expand on the lore but have its own unique tale, which makes it really good for newcomers who don't want to play the first game. They can just jump into Silent Hill 2 without any problems, and the static view of the camera makes it feel much more melancholy. This one shot of a wide view being held for 2 minutes is so powerful as it just allows you to take in the setting and listen to James remembering his wife with no cuts in between. One other thing worth bringing up is that the music in these scenes is very well orchestrated. It sounds like music that you would hear while being stranded in a blanket of fog, and it works in reeling you into the setting with how soft and soothing it is, like the game is trying to help you be prepared for the horrors that await you. And the tone perfectly captures the psyche of the character. James feels deep depression, trapped in it, making it feel like a true nightmare he can't wake up from. This is what he felt knowing that his wife was gone from this world, and his desperation to be with her again drove him to make the incredibly irrational decision to believe that it was her that wrote the letter. Deep down, he knows it wasn't her, but he'd rather let his own warped mind take control if it meant somehow seeing her again. If he can psych himself into believing he's having nothing but a bad dream, maybe he'll wake up and be happy again. It's sounds of loneliness, aimless wandering, feeling pale, wanting to believe that a lost loved one is still alive, a locked up regret, sealed away in his own mind, with a slight tinge of a happier time. It's haunting but also beautiful. It truly displays how desperate he is to find Mary and to feel good again. Other survival horror tracks tend to focus on inducing an extreme sense of anxiety or panic, but Silent Hill's music is different. It focuses on the emotions and inner struggles of the cast, helping you connect with them on a more intimate level. And the music throughout this opening works as a settling calm before a great storm. This is the most atmospheric initial soundtrack I've ever heard in a game, because of how perfectly it throws you into the game's atmosphere and characters in 3 minutes. And so we take full control of James as we make our way to the town, starting with a long pathway through a foggy forest. The music that plays over this feels really warped but also somewhat entrancing, like it's signaling the beginning of a nightmare. It accompanies James throughout the forest as it gets more haunting with every step. One long curved dirt path, wild dogs barking in the distance, the fog concealing your line of sight. It has a sense of prevalence that makes it more nerve-wracking to walk through this area, like you're afraid of a wolf or a bear suddenly appearing to attack you. And the long curved declining pathway symbolizes James' descent into madness. Soon enough, we find ourselves in a graveyard where we meet a wandering stranger. We have a conversation with her regarding the mysterious nature of the town and learn that she's also looking for someone in Silent Hill. Her mom, to be precise. But given her mannerisms of speaking and how she addresses her as mama, there's a sign that there's something off with her. But not really in a bad way. She comes across as timid but also helpful and willing, and the tranquil music playing in the background helps you get used to her presence. It's supposed to be somewhat peaceful, but the strange and stilted dialogue creates a feeling of uneasiness. Then James' line of "I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not" gives you a kind of chill in your bones, a sense of foreboding for what's coming up next because James just implied that he doesn't care about his own safety. We learn later that her name is Angela and she has a really disturbing backstory. So this gentle music along with her calm and peaceful introduction is a really good contrast for setting up her story later down the line. As the player continues to the town, there's another long pathway to venture through, but as you walk through the highway you notice the music is starting to sound more distorted and intimidating. Something like wrong piano notes accompanying you as you make your way through this path. Eventually the music builds up to sounds of whispering winds, resembling echoes of hollow voices, and suddenly turning into a roaring screech, like a loud chilling hiss. This is when the soundtrack starts to truly terrify you, with a chilling, disturbing score following you down the road. This generates a feeling of darkness, isolation, and abandonment, but it's more slowly paced with proper build-up to its more intense notes. It feels very dissonant and abstract compared to other horror game soundtracks that throw loud booming noises at you without building them up. This is what a survival horror soundtrack is supposed to sound like. From the first note you hear after exiting the graveyard, you know that the journey is going to be more oppressive and horrible than anything, generating a raw, pulsating feeling as you approach the derelict town. And after a long walk, you finally reach Silent Hill, an abandoned town wrapped in a blanket of endless fog. Eventually, James finds a stain of blood on the road, while being met with a mysterious figure disappearing into the fog. And this is where the exploration of Silent Hill truly begins, and it's one of the game's most powerful elements. The world of Silent Hill 2 is a horrifying one, yet strangely, it also feels cozy and soothing. There's a sense of enigma that accompanies you throughout the town, wandering the streets through the fog. It's empty and bleak with no sign of life, yet there's something about it that pushes you to keep going. The uncertainty and tension of it causes an uncomfortable mood, yet you're free to go about it at your own pace. This is the beauty of the open world of Silent Hill. It never forces you to go too fast or run through everything. You can spend the majority of the game just walking from place to place without the urgency of getting to the next story beat. The ambience of the streets combined with the mysterious fog and the nerve-wracking music creates an addictive tone that most games don't have. This is one of the few games where I prefer to walk and take my time with it instead of running to the next objective. And the melancholy emptiness of the town gives it so much atmosphere and personality. And I really do think that the biggest contributor is the fog. The fog in Silent Hill 2 is an essential factor to what makes the world so interesting, as it provides the player with so many feelings of uncertainty. It's so thick that you can't see anything from far away, yet it provides you with just enough visibility that you can freely navigate the town. The cloudy appearance of the fog also helps to make the atmosphere feel more lit instead of just making it dark and hard to see anything. It provides you with a visual picture that allows you to see where you're going but still making you feel insecure, because the fog also conceals the many dangers lurking around. The monsters can blend perfectly into the fog, making it difficult to see where they're coming from. It creates a deep feeling of anxiety not knowing what's coming next, but because of the wide open space you're provided, you don't feel trapped. You can freely maneuver and navigate around enemies to avoid confrontation, and with how slow the enemies move, you don't have to worry about running and breaking the pace of your playstyle if you prefer walking. You can simply walk away from enemies at a normal pace, resuming your exploration and story progress. This is the most ingenious element of Silent Hill 2's exploration. In spite of how dangerous and closed off the town feels, it provides the player with so much freedom. There's no narrow hallways where you're forced to fight an enemy, and there's no enemies that relentlessly chase after you. They walk really slowly to allow the player to better appreciate the layout of the game's world. And the layout of this world is very mesmerizing for its simplicity. It truly feels like you're actually in Silent Hill with the freedom and well-designed atmosphere you're provided with, giving you the incentive to either explore and look for resources or uncover mysteries surrounding the town. It's a world that feels alive in its own creepy way, making it both fun and unsettling to explore. A perfect combination of setting, gameplay, design, and pace. Eventually, James finds himself in a secluded cave, drawn by the sound of a radio, and this is his first encounter with the supernatural monsters of Silent Hill. But he has a really unique reaction to this creature. When the heroes of this type of story come across a monster, you would expect them to react accordingly, right? A shocked and terrified expression, a scream of fear, running out of there as fast as possible. Well, James doesn't do any of that. He casually stares the monster down, looks for a weapon, and prepares to fight it without a hint of emotion. James' initial reaction isn't to run, it's to attack. When James told Angela that he doesn't care if it's dangerous or not, he was being serious. He was going to Silent Hill to find his wife or die trying, which you'd think makes him a really brave and courageous character. But as we proceed through the story, we'll learn that there's a more disturbing reason for his lack of fear. After defeating the monster, James takes the radio and leaves, believing it to be a useful tool. Generally, the radio can be used to signal the presence of monsters so you can be prepared for them. But in this particular cutscene, James hears a really faint noise, almost as if someone is trying to talk to him through the radio. Will this come back later? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. To get to the next story beat, the player must follow a series of events leading them to the Woodside Hotel. If you want, you can either explore the town or practice getting used to the game's combat. Admittedly, the combat isn't really the game's strong suit, as James' melee attacks are really slow and rely on precise timing, making it feel really clunky. But I think it sells the point that in Silent Hill, the player is discouraged from fighting optional enemies. Unlike Dead Space and Resident Evil that are built around combat and strategy, Silent Hill has you in control of an everyman with no combat experience. It does help to explain the awkward way in which James fights enemies. If anything, it adds to the tension and anxiety by establishing how the characters of Silent Hill are more vulnerable than in Resident Evil or Dead Space. So I would suggest doing what I do. Focus on exploration and avoid fighting altogether. While exploring the town, James comes across a message on a wall that reads, "There was a hole here. It's gone now." But what could it mean? We'll probably have to wait for later. Eventually, James finds himself in the Woodside Hotel where things get really dark and hard to see. Now that you're indoors with no source of light, you have to find some kind of flashlight. Eventually you do find one hanging from a woman's dress in one of the apartments. But if you take the time to examine the dress, James will notice something familiar about it, like he's seen this dress before. Could it be one of the dresses that Mary used to wear? If it is, how can it be here and why? Either way, navigating the indoor area is much more dangerous than being outside, because the buildings you explore don't offer the wide open spaces that you had earlier. It's a series of narrow hallways where you're more likely to be attacked by enemies while trying to run past them. It's pretty claustrophobic, so you have to practice more caution when going through these areas. As James explores the hotel further, he tries to reach for a key before it's kicked away by a mysterious little girl, who sees this as a way to prank James. Well, we'll just have to find another way to the key. We make our way through the hotel as we come across a few more oddities, including a mysterious baby cry and a sinister-looking creature with a pyramid-shaped head. But it doesn't really seem to do anything. It just stands there, looking at James blankly. In spite of not doing anything to threaten James, it still feels really unsettling. The way it just stands there staring at James, almost as if it's judging him for something. It simply feels ominous and wrong, and its ungodly design just makes it feel scarier. Ignoring the creature for now, you enter the next room where you can interact with a butchered body in front of a static TV. James asks what could have done this, but once again he seems pretty casual about it, like he's more annoyed than shocked. And it really doesn't get any better with the unsettling music going on in the area. It almost sounds like someone is breathing really heavy through some kind of mask, making the atmosphere of the apartment much more suffocating. This is another example of how the right tone of music can really add to a game's ambience, as it enhances the emotion of the experience without being too loud. Still not convinced? Well, how about the music that plays in the butterfly room? James enters the room to obtain the clock key, but it's accompanied by a really dreary bit of music. A mechanical verb accompanied by echoes of footsteps that evolve into rusty scratching noises. The way the music builds up makes it seem as if there's something in the room with you, especially during the 1-minute mark with the rusty scratching noises. Almost like some kind of torture device is somewhere inside. This is the kind of music you expect to hear when a monster is lurking around and stalking you, creating an even deeper layer of anxiety. But the unique thing about this room is that there's actually no monster inside. You just enter the room, get the clock key, and leave. This is a really good example of the soundtrack playing tricks on you, how it baits you into thinking you're about to encounter a new monster or something, when in reality it's just a soundtrack messing with your head, tricking you into a false sense of insecurity. A really powerful example of how the music of Silent Hill 2 adds to the ambience of the abandoned town. Making your way to the 3rd floor, this is where you obtain 2 keys needed to proceed through the game. The first one is the key the girl kicked away. The second one being in an apartment room where you meet a really grotesque sight. Remember the pyramid head monster from before? He's in here ripping a bunch of monsters into pieces. The image just jumps at you out of nowhere and James' first instinct is to hide. As Pyramid Head walks towards the closet, there's a brief moment of cinematography where we see things from James' point of view. The eerie otherworldly feel of the shot makes it look like the creature isn't just staring at James. He's also staring at you, the player. This huge, sharp, blood-covered piece of metal staring right at you as he prepares to attack. It just feels extremely cold and disgusting, but instead of attacking, it just leaves. Really interesting. Whatever this pyramid head thing seems to be, it seems to be a really genuine threat we have to watch out for, even managing to get a stronger reaction out of James. It seems that this particular monster has a really different effect on him compared to the others. As James continues through the hotel, he eventually enters a room with the sound of someone vomiting. In the corner of the room, there's a dead body crammed in the fridge, with the sound of vomiting coming from the bathroom. James enters the bathroom to find a fat guy throwing up in the toilet, and his first instinct upon seeing James is denying killing the person in the fridge. Interesting. The two share a conversation regarding the monsters in the town as the sick man tells James his name, Eddie. At first you might not make much of this conversation, just the two of them talking about how something brought them to the town. But if you enter the next room, you see a pretty interesting hint regarding Eddie's background. Mysterious football posters hung around the walls, and there's even a football on the floor. But what does football have to do with Eddie? Well, we'll have to wait and see later. We continue exploring the apartments until we eventually reunite with Angela. This time the two properly introduce themselves as James tries to talk Angela out of whatever she's planning to do with the knife in her hand. This is a really chilling encounter, especially if you try seeing it from Angela's perspective. The way she talks sounds really exhausted and disgusted, hinting at the effect the town seems to have on her. She wanders around for an unknown amount of time surrounded by monsters, only to find another human being in the form of someone who's trying to help her, something no one really seems to be offering her. And the piano music accompanying this is strangely calm in spite of how ominous it is. It feels really light and relaxed, as if to signify James' efforts to calm Angela down. The knife also plays a really interesting role besides being an object of self-harm. Angela is able to detect James' presence in the room, but she never looks at the mirror to notice it's him. And that's because she sees him through the reflection on her knife. She's so focused on that knife that it's her only window to the presence of another human being. That is such a brilliant and disturbing detail that foreshadows how mentally damaged and traumatized she is. As the two continue talking, the conversation takes some interesting turns. Angela mentions how they're both the same, believing that it's easier to run away because it's what they deserve, with James denying he isn't like that. Although he doesn't realize it now, he will eventually learn that what Angela is saying here is much truer than he believes. He tells Angela how his wife died 3 years ago, yet is trying to reassure her that he's not crazy by looking for a dead person. Pretty sure that's foreshadowing for something else. Either way, the conversation ends with James offering to take Angela's knife so she doesn't do anything to hurt herself. At first she agrees, but as James tries to reach for the knife, she suddenly screams in terror while holding it against him, almost as if she's trying to defend herself from him. After coming to her senses, she apologizes and places the knife down before walking away. But notice how throughout the conversation that she's constantly saying I'm sorry, even when she has no reason to. That's because people going through severe trauma can end up going through a lot of self-loathing and become heavily apologetic. It's an important detail to keep in mind as it helps reflect on both herself and James. One other detail to notice is the body language they use as they talk. Angela's movements and gestures are really uneven and unorthodox, demonstrating how frail and vulnerable she is emotionally. James, on the other hand, behaves with notable caution as he tries talking to her. He keeps his distance to avoid getting hurt, but also to avoid appearing as threatening to Angela. And as she holds the knife against him, he takes a step back while holding up his hand. It shows how James is trying to be supportive while also holding a boundary between himself and Angela, which further supports the notion that the two are connected more than he thinks. He wants to hold on to the concept of fighting, but all these attempts to deny being similar to another person giving up sends a really unnerving sign. This is one of the most important and well-written scenes in the game because this one moment between James and Angela drastically changes the trajectory of the story. It's here that we realize just how deep things are gonna be, and how there's a lot more to the characters than what we're seeing. Angela was introduced as a seemingly normal person looking for her mother, but now she's lying on the ground with a knife and she was clearly going through thoughts of self-harm. It's pretty easy to tell that there's something really off-putting and messed up about her that we're not seeing yet. It's a really well-paced and voice-acted scene, with really good cinematography and music to boot. But there's one more detail to find in this scene. After taking control of James, you can walk to the center of the room and find a torn family photo. Whatever Angela is going through, it clearly has something to do with her parents, particularly her dad, given the way the picture is torn. Another creepy detail for later. We venture through the rest of the hotel section, and this is when the music really starts to get scary. At one point, James has to jump between Woodside and Blue Creek to proceed in Silent Hill, and it's made very apparent very quickly that Blue Creek has its own separate soundtrack, a low bass horn sounding off, sounds of heavy breathing, whistling winds, beating drums, but not coming off as too intense or loud. It's soft but also really threatening and devoid of comfort. The transition between soundtracks in this game really fits the tone of the story, starting off as something normal before quickly becoming something more and more distorted. This is the soundtrack warning you that from this point, it's only going to get worse. And boy was it right, because this is where we come across Pyramid Head again. But this time there's no way to escape. This is the first instance in the game where you have no choice but to fight. A really scary turn for a game that up to this point allowed you to freely avoid fighting enemies. And it's even more scary with the small size of the room. The strategy for this boss fight is to avoid his sword attacks until the siren goes off. You can speed up the fight by using your pistol to shoot him, and it's also really helpful as it reduces his movement and attack speed. Although it's not a complex encounter, it's still pretty tense with the way you're encouraged to maneuver and dodge his attacks. Eventually the siren sounds off and Pyramid Head leaves through a flooded stairway. The water drains, and with no other way out, we have no choice but to follow Pyramid Head outside. Thankfully, he's nowhere to be seen as we continue towards the park where Mary is believed to be waiting for us. But wait, what's that noise? A distant horn going on and off at a slow pace. It must be the iconic exploration music. While it's not the first tune you hear when exploring Silent Hill 2, it seems to be the soundtrack that comes to people's mind when they think about the open world exploration, and I can certainly see why. When I think about any particular track from this game, chances are this is the first one that comes to my head. If you were to imagine yourself exploring an abandoned derelict town, this is the exact kind of music you'd expect it to have for a theme song. It truly feels like you're alone, isolated from civilization, surrounded by supernatural creatures. You get the sensation that you're being followed, that something is hunting you from the shadows, waiting for you to let your guard down. And with the dense fog surrounding you, you won't even know what it is. You have no idea what's out there, but with no other way to go, you step forward anyway. It's unsettling, but also quiet and soft. In spite of it being used in a haunting way, it's also strangely relaxing, almost like it's something you could fall asleep to. The tone of the music combined with the fog paints a picture that's both scary and welcoming. It creates the suspension of not knowing when something's gonna jump at you, while keeping you motivated and focused in a soothing way. In spite of most likely being the same 15 seconds of sound on continual loop, this is one of the most mesmerizing pieces of music I've ever heard in a video game. Once again, this is the kind of soundtrack a survival horror game should have. Haunting while not being so intense that it breaks your immersion with the atmosphere. Not even Resident Evil has pulled off this level of subtlety. It's really amazing music for this game. Anyway, we continue towards the park where Mary is waiting for us until we eventually come across that girl who kicked the key earlier. And in this first interaction, she appears to be pretty smug and condescending. She also seems to hold a personal grudge towards James as she somehow knows about Mary. And just before she leaves James, she claims that he never loved her, leaving him in shock and confusion. Who is this kid? How does she know about Mary? And why would she accuse James of not caring about her? So much mystery is contained in this brief interaction, making you question who this child is. Is she real? A fragment of James' imagination? Is he starting to go crazy? There's also an important detail in this conversation you might not notice the first time. James asks her what she's doing out here alone, and her response is, "Are you blind or something?" This is a pretty heavy indication that the girl is able to see something James can't. He's blind to something, but what that something is, you don't know. All you know for now is that this girl may hold a clue to the oddities in Silent Hill and what may have happened to Mary 3 years ago. But now we're at the park, and we make our way to the pier where a woman is waiting for us. Is it Mary? No, it's actually a woman named Maria, a physically attractive seductress who seems rather interested in James for some reason. Now, in order to fully understand who or what Mary is, we're gonna have to take a quick detour. You see, the thing about Silent Hill 2 is that it was released during a time before DLC was a thing. So when it was originally released on the PS2, it was just a singular campaign focusing on James. It wouldn't be until several months later when the game would be re-released with additional content. Initially, it was released as the Restless Dreams edition on the Xbox, but it would eventually come out for the PS2 in greatest hits copies of the game. This additional content includes improved lighting effects and a joke ending. But more importantly, this special edition of the game included an entire other campaign roughly 30 to 40 minutes long. In this special mode, you play as Maria, and we learn more about her past, her true nature, and her connection with James. This scenario is called Born from a Wish. The story follows Maria struggling with herself while helping a mysterious stranger reunite with his lost daughter. In spite of its relatively short length, it ends up revealing so much about Maria. In the beginning, she believes herself to be a real person who lived a full life, and she just wants to survive while finding other people to engage with. She's obviously scared of being alone and doesn't want to die. And yet, the thought of death intrigues her. Aside from the disturbing detail you can find if you examine her gun at the start of the mode, she also seems to have a strange connection to James and his search for Mary. At one point she explores a child's room, and upon examining some of the items inside, she seems to recall memories of someone else's life. She recalls the life of a woman befriending a young child while she was staying at the hospital. But why is she remembering this now? Why does she seem to have another person's memories? Well, eventually she finds the answer in a very unpleasant way. After helping the man reunite with his deceased daughter, Maria comes to a shocking revelation. She's not a real person. She's a figment of Silent Hill created to punish James for something horrible he did in the past. Finding out that her whole life was a lie, she contemplates ending it all. But just as she's about to go through with it, she has a sudden realization. She discards her revolver and sets out to find James. And so the story ends with Maria meeting up with James at the park. As a standalone story, it's pretty well written, especially in regards to the story of the girl and her father. With only 10 seconds of audio from the attic section, you can figure out their entire story and how sad it is. But as an expansion of the original campaign while developing Maria's character, it does wonders in enhancing the overall story. Maria struggling with her own existence while coming to terms with her true nature is a pretty sad story when you think about it. In spite of being the main villain of the game, you end up feeling sorry for her because she was never given a choice. She's forced to be a pawn in the town's game to punish James. It's almost like she's surrendering to fate. She had a chance to escape and refuse to fulfill her role, but she didn't. When she throws her gun away, it's because she comes to terms with the reality that she can't die even if she wanted to. That she's just part of the town to punish James, just like all the other monsters. And to torture James further, Maria takes on the physical appearance of a sexualized version of Mary, representing his sexual frustration after Mary fell ill. Basically, Maria is a manifestation for James meant to torture him by giving him something close to his wife, feeding off of his desire to be reunited with her. In a sense, Maria was born from a wish.
He said it! He said it!
But Maria's own storyline is well executed too. The core of her campaign is basically her contemplating the meaning of reality, staring out into the empty town wondering if she has any further purpose in living. Even though a part of her knew the truth, it hurt too much to accept, so she tried to deny it for as long as she could. Maybe it could be that deep down, Maria is more than just a manifestation of James' mind. She acts like a good person, showing empathy and concern for the father who lost his daughter. She has feelings and emotions that separate her from the other creatures in the town, and she struggles with these emotions while having an existential identity crisis. She was born into a nightmarish world where her only purpose in life was being some sort of punishment for a crazy guy. She clearly has her own will, but it was slowly stripped away from her as the story went on, which is actually pretty soul-crushing to watch. It's part of the reason why she avoids ending herself. She can't die because she's not truly alive, and yet there's a part of her that hopes she can become alive. If Maria can somehow manipulate James into forgetting about Mary and starting a new life with her, she might become a real human being and become her own person like she wanted. So her goal is to regain the individuality that Silent Hill stripped from her, and the only way she can accomplish this goal is by getting into James' mind. It's a diabolical yet sympathetic motivation for a villain, wanting to be alive instead of just a figment of someone's imagination. It's the only way she can avoid being trapped and alone. She pretty much has no other choice to manipulate James into living out his delusions and letting go of his own reality. But sadly, she can't escape her fate. Even if she succeeds in her plan, she has to live knowing that she's simply a replacement for Mary, and that he doesn't really love her for who she is. But without him, she has no purpose or reason to keep going and would just be as lonely. She's damned if she does and damned if she doesn't. She's completely trapped and she doesn't even realize it. That's the tragedy of Maria, someone who just wanted to be alive but was never allowed to be. It's a really sad and powerful subplot that adds so much depth to her scenes in the original campaign. It expands the story in a meaningful way, making it even more fascinating than if the original campaign was just standing on its own. Because now, all of Maria's actions throughout the story make full sense. But there's one question that remains to be answered. If Maria was created to punish James, what is he being punished for? What did he do that was so wrong? Well, there's only one way to find out. We have to resume the main storyline. So James meets Maria and he finds himself fascinated by how much she looks and sounds like Mary. And knowing what we know from the bonus campaign, this interaction becomes very unsettling. Maria sets her plan to seduce James in motion and she appears really confident and alluring. Her expressions and tone when speaking with James are extremely calculated. Her eyes are also very intimidating, only changing to be more accusatory and piercing when discussing Mary. In spite of not knowing James for more than 30 seconds, the way in which she gets into his mind is extremely eerie. At one point she questions if James really did love Mary, similar to that kid from earlier. But then she takes it a step further by suggesting he secretly hated her, to which James is really defensive in denying it. The way in which she brings this up to him is really slimy and spine-chilling, almost as if she's saying, I know your secret. And that playful comeback when she asks James if she looks like a ghost? She is a ghost, one trying to manipulate and punish him for his past. And yet, strangely enough, that's not even the scariest thing about this scene. Up to this point, James has properly introduced himself to every human character he comes across, telling Eddie and Angela his name. He doesn't tell the girl his name, but since she knows about Mary, it's a safe bet that she already knows who James is. But here, James doesn't do anything to properly introduce himself to Maria, only focusing on Mary and how she reminds him of her. He never tells her his name, and yet she's constantly calling him by name in the following cutscenes. And James never stops to question how she knows his name beforehand. Not only is this a disturbing clue to her true nature, but it also signals how mentally warped James actually is. And Maria manages to take advantage of this perfectly. This first meeting with Maria is so disturbing on so many levels, especially with the context from the bonus campaign. It's the perfect representation of how easily an alluring woman can play with your psyche, and she still manages to come off as a trustworthy companion. This is how you write a scary yet helpful party member when you first meet them. Their behavior is so eerie that you can't help but feel as if something is off, but at the same time they lure you into a safe sense of security. And even then, there's one more detail to this scene that sells where James' mental state is. When he first meets Maria, believing her to be Mary, he sounds genuinely happy and cracks a smile. You can see how joyful he is at the thought of finding his missing wife, and when he sees it's someone else, he sounds really heartbroken. The way he says no you're not is so painful and depressing that you end up feeling bad for him, especially when knowing how Maria is starting to get to him. But if he was that hopeful about finding Mary, maybe being manipulated by Maria won't be that simple. Our next objective is to get to the Lakeview Hotel across the lake, but most of the pathways appear to be closed off. Our only option is to go to the local bowling alley. Inside, we see Eddie eating pizza while arguing with the snot-nosed kid. We learn that her name is Laura and she actually came to Silent Hill looking for Mary just like James. We also learned that Eddie was running away because he was scared of something, and he ended up coming to Silent Hill while running away. This interaction between Laura and Eddie is actually pretty nice as it shows a more humble side to Eddie's personality. Normally when people make fun of him or berate him for his weight, he gets hostile, but with Laura he just shrugs it off as a kid being mischievous. So it's interesting to see he's capable of some level of restraint. With that said, there's something suspicious about the stuff Eddie is talking about. First he denies killing someone while vomiting, then he says that he's running away from something. And now in spite of all the scary things surrounding him, he's just casually eating a pizza. I'm pretty sure that's not the first thing you should do if you were vomiting 30 minutes ago. You'd think he would be more freaked out by the oddities surrounding the town, but he doesn't seem to care very much. But he's clearly scared of something, otherwise he wouldn't have admitted it. This scene tries to portray him as being harmless and lazy, yet there's still something strange regarding his behavior and the things he's been saying. The music also sounds particularly suspicious. The first time we meet Eddie, the soundtrack is somewhat ominous and slow, but in the bowling alley it sounds more laid back and upbeat, almost like it's trying to throw you off so you don't suspect him. Or maybe he really is just a harmless bum. Either way, Laura runs away and James tries to go after her. He follows her outside when Maria tells him she ran through the back alley. They try to follow her, but the pathway is too narrow. They'll have to go through the nearby building, but the door leading inside is locked. But Maria conveniently seems to have the key to unlock it, and the way she draws the key from her clothes is rather alluring, like she's clearly trying to tease James while unlocking the door. Another sign of her sinister intentions. They enter the building, and while making their way to the other side, James can interact with some beer bottles, and the player learns he became alcoholic to deal with the pain regarding Mary's illness and death. It's an interesting window to how Mary's illness affected him and how bad his depression got after she passed. We then find out that the building we're going through is an adult bar called Heaven's Night. Yeah, the suggestive way Maria unlocked the door is starting to make a lot of sense. The music that plays during this area is also really peculiar. It's sensual, but also mysterious and foggy, like it's trying to conceal Mary's true intentions behind her behavior towards James. The ambience of it is alluring while also being sinister given what Maria's trying to do, making it come across as really twisted in spite of its soft nature. But it also might reflect James' experience in Silent Hill. The song has a really curious touch, where it sounds sad, peaceful, mysterious, dark, melancholy, and comforting all at the same time. It could represent a calmer side of James' psyche, where he needs a place to relax and feel the warmth he once had with Mary. Having something like this gives you a really needed moment of tranquility in a horror game. similar to the typewriter room in Resident Evil 4. Eventually we go outside and James walks down the stairs to the street, with Maria somehow mysteriously teleporting to the bottom of the stairs. And of course James doesn't question it. They follow Laura down the street until she enters a nearby hospital, and so we enter what's probably the most difficult section of the game. Brookhaven Hospital. This is where the combat really starts to become challenging. Unlike other enemies where it's safer to run past them, the nurses are much more aggressive and numerous. Their attacks deal more damage and they have more reach since they use steel pipes, and they can very easily overwhelm you if you're not prepared. It's also a really ugly and worn out location. Every room, every hallway looks like the building was completely consumed in fire, and the soundtrack doesn't make it any less disturbing. It starts off as this really low bass piano before shifting to sounds of heavy breathing, almost as if the hospital itself is this great beast with terror living inside. Some people have suggested the breathing is actually a reference to Mary during her illness, and if that's the case, that makes it even worse, like she's haunting James from beyond the grave by possessing the hospital. The music accompanying you throughout the hospital is straight up demonic, with every single room having some disturbing track to it. This is a huge whiplash from the gentle music we had in the bowling alley in Heaven's Night, and it's once again a perfect use of the game's music, demonstrating how it can transition from something lighthearted to evil and foul. Every element of the hospital is a spitting image of survival horror. The music, atmosphere, enemies, and shift in combat make it a standout level compared to the rest of the game. James and Maria make their way through the hospital until she starts to feel tired. James suggests she rests in one of the patient rooms while he looks for Laura. Before you leave, it's possible to talk to her for some interesting optional dialogue, including her asking him what he's gonna do if he doesn't find Mary. Foreshadowing? Probably. We continue through the hospital until we find Laura in one of the patient rooms. James questions her about Mary, to which Laura says that she met her at the hospital last year. That doesn't make sense. Mary died 3 years ago. James even starts to accuse her of lying and getting short with her. This interaction is rather interesting as it captures a more strict and aggressive side of James, but he also makes an effort to be reasonable as he's speaking with a young child. But when Mary's death is brought up to him, he gets really defensive and accusatory, almost like he's trying to repress an uncomfortable truth. So there's clearly more to James than what we've seen so far. But even more interesting is when James asks how Laura made it through Silent Hill without any injuries. You'd think she would have been attacked by those monsters by now. And Laura replies with, "Why should I?" But that can't be possible. There's no way a vulnerable kid like Laura made it this far into Silent Hill without being attacked by monsters. Unless, it might be possible that those creatures aren't real to her. But even if the monsters aren't real, why wouldn't Laura still be afraid? Silent Hill is an abandoned haunted town covered in fog, and all the buildings are rusted and falling apart. Laura should be at least a little bit scared of this town, but she's not. Well, that's because to Laura, Silent Hill isn't a haunted town. And this is when one of the most important revelations of the game is revealed to us. Silent Hill is different for every individual who enters the town, taking on a different form depending on who you are. Laura's version of Silent Hill must be sunny and welcoming as opposed to foggy and cloudy. Where James sees rusted up buildings and ugly looking monsters, Laura sees plant life growing out of the abandoned buildings and butterflies flying around. A more cheerful interpretation of an abandoned town. This is what Laura meant when she said, "Are you blind or something?" Because James is blind to her version of Silent Hill. And if that's the case, Silent Hill must also be different for Eddie and Angela, seeing their own version of the abandoned town. This would explain their behavior and different mannerisms when talking to James. But if everyone has their own version of Silent Hill depending on what person they are, what does that mean for James? His version of Silent Hill is a foggy, rusty, abandoned town filled with deformed monsters while being reminded of his late wife. It might have to do with deep-seated memories of Mary that James is having a hard time coming to terms with. What these memories are, we'll have to wait until later. While escorting her out of the hospital, Laura tells James that she forgot a letter from Mary in another room. He goes inside to look for it, only to be tricked and locked inside by Laura. As James tries to get out, a horrifying creature emerges from the ceiling. And so we're met with a second boss encounter. 3 massive blobs of flesh hanging from the ceiling chasing you around a tiny room. Unlike Pyramid Head, however, these creatures can be killed, making the fight more straightforward. Use the shotgun to kill them as fast as possible while occasionally running to the opposite side of the room to avoid damage. Now with this taking place in a hospital, it's pretty clear that these monsters resemble sickly bodies in hospital beds. They might even resemble Mary's sickly body and how James was forced to listen to her verbal frustration as she was unable to deal with her illness. Maybe they represent other sickly people James saw while visiting the hospital, knowing that Mary was turning into one of them. For an enemy that's relatively easy to defeat, it's a pretty interesting bit of symbolism. After defeating them, we're shown a POV shot as James looks like he's being dragged down to a hellish place. And while being dragged down, we hear Mary whispering for James. A really unsettling transition as James finds himself outside. Upon re-entering the hospital, we see that it's much more disgusting and abhorrent than before. So now, it's very apparent that James has been dragged down to the other side. Everyone has two sides of Silent Hill, a normal one and the other world. It's always been something of an abstract concept, though in this case it seems to be the town taking on a darker form to reflect James' deteriorating sanity. The town seems to be concealed in multiple layers for James, symbolizing his descent into madness the further he gets into the town. And the hospital becomes even more ugly and rusted. There's also a lot of mold and faded concrete with sheets covering everything up. Even when walking into an area with enemies in it, the room looks more dusty and unclean as opposed to crimson and gory. And honestly, I find that sort of atmosphere to be more creepy. They didn't need a bunch of blood and dead bodies lying around. They just had to make the hospital look abandoned and left to decay. In a way, the hospital could also be a reflection of the sickness that was eating away at Mary. All of the rooms are festered with rot and rust, resembling the inside of a dying creature's failing body. There's something strangely organic about this place, like it's trying to call out to James through all these messed up visuals reminding him of his wife. It makes the hospital appear to be even more devilish than before. All these disturbing details following you through every corner as you try to escape and get outside make for a really stressful area. So you continue through the hospital until you reunite with Maria, who once again James mistakes for Mary, and with him having a subpar reaction to her being alive, she gets really angry. Of course, this could be her frustration at her failed attempts to seduce him, but it could also be a result of her absorbing more of Mary's memories. At the end of the cutscene, Maria talks about Laura and is extremely worried about her, determined to protect her despite not knowing her. She seems to be having Mary's memories of the time Laura spent with her at the hospital, which means she could also be having memories of her time with James. So it's very possible that her relationship with James is starting to be more complex. Instead of just trying to manipulate him, her attachment to him is becoming authentic. That any way she yells at James when he dismisses her is extremely raw, like she's putting her whole throat into that scream. And it's pretty understandable since he's showing he doesn't seem to care about her safety or well-being. We know from the bonus campaign that Maria isn't like the other monsters created to haunt James. She has feelings and self-awareness, and she was created as an avatar to reflect Mary. And because she's absorbed so many of her memories, it doesn't feel like she's acting anymore. She was genuinely devastated by the truth of her existence being a lie, and now she's surrendering to her hardwired goal in a desperate attempt to grasp at a meaning to her life. James is literally all she has. At this point, she's desperate to be accepted by James, and it really hurts her that he just views her as a replacement for Mary. She wants to be with him so she can seem real, and you really start to pity her as she becomes scared beyond her limits. There's a strong possibility that with Mary's memory, she's starting to feel the mood swing she had when she was dying. Her bipolar attitude in this scene is a reflection of what Mary was going through, and how it could have led to her verbally abusing James before she died, berating James for not caring about her yet wanting him to stay with her. Stuff like this makes Mary a really sympathetic villain. There's a method to her actions and her desire to be a real person that's profound and organic. It actually makes her one of the most well-written characters in the Silent Hill series. So with that out of the way, we make our way through the last section of the hospital, and we're almost at the final elevator, when suddenly, Pyramid Head strikes again. Chasing the two down to the elevator, James manages to make it, but the elevator starts to close before Maria can get inside. He tries to open it, but to no avail, and suddenly we hear a spear piercing through flesh, and Maria's body falls limp, leaving James alone in the elevator traveling up. Left in shock of what had just happened, he leans against the elevator door, slowly sliding to the floor, and hangs his head in shame. Even after the elevator doors open, he's still sitting there, motionless, blind to the outside world. This scene is amazingly heartbreaking, perfectly capturing the hopelessness James is going through after Maria's death. Even if you don't care much for Maria yourself, you can still see how badly it hurts James, a woman nearly identical to his wife, giving him a semblance of being with Mary again, having just died right in front of him. He failed to save Mary from her illness, and now he failed to save Maria from Silent Hill. He's completely crushed, sapped of the will to push himself forward. Notice how he has his back turned against the elevator, and continuing to stay in that pose even after the door opens. It's a really reckless thing to do in a place filled with monsters trying to kill you, and yet James doesn't seem to care. He's obviously not in the right mind, only thinking about how he failed Maria. This detail highlights a very crucial element of James' character, his utter disregard for his own life. At this point, he's so broken that he no longer cares if he lives or dies. Despite knowing there are monsters in the hospital, he doesn't move an inch. He's so hurt by Maria's death and being reminded of losing Mary that common sense has completely left his mind. Maria was starting to rub off on James, becoming a person he wanted to protect. And given what she means to him and what it implies, we see how much her death affects him. It's a scene where you manage to have huge empathy for the characters before you fully understand the rest of the story, which is really genuine and effective writing. And the music that plays over this is perfect. The way the piano starts playing while holding on to the shot of James losing hope is really impactful. It's a simple solo, but it also sounds very melancholic. It captures the feelings of despair, hopelessness, failure, and grief encompassing James as the truth of the situation sinks in. There was nothing he could do for Maria, just like he couldn't do anything for Mary. All he could do was watch. The way the piano notes pause for a few seconds really helped to amplify the isolation James is feeling. It really captures the feeling of losing someone you care about, or the guilt you feel that you let them down. It shows how weak and vulnerable someone can feel when they know they hurt someone they cared for, representing how James feels responsible for both Mary and Maria, and he just can't take the pain of it any longer. It's amazing music that perfectly conveys the depression and emptiness that James is feeling after losing someone he was starting to get attached to. They didn't have to include any dialogue to express his sadness, not even any audio of him crying, just that one shot of him sitting alone, cradled in the elevator. It's a scene that shows how Silent Hill 2 isn't just a horror game, it's a story of drama and sadness. And there's no monsters or jump scares to ruin these types of scenes. You're allowed to get involved with the characters and storyline, empathizing with them and feeling their suffering. And then the music just keeps playing, leaving you with nothing to do but leave the hospital. And it just keeps playing until you walk outside. Silent Hill is doing so much to drill into James' psyche that he can't do anything to save the people he cares about. There's only one path for him to go. To keep pushing himself forward and find the truth. You feel safe and relieved knowing that there's no monsters waiting to attack you, but you also feel lost knowing that James was unable to save someone. Going through what's left of the hospital while the music plays in the background makes exiting the building feel really gloomy and wrong. Like Maria is supposed to be beside you, but she's not. This scene is so powerful on so many levels, from the ambience of the music to the crushed state of James' mind. It's an incredible demonstration of sadness and loss. Following a map by the exit of the hospital, James follows a path that eventually leads him to the Silent Hill History Museum. But now, it's nightfall. The cloudy daylight and the fog from earlier are gone, leaving you with nothing but blackness. It's the same music as before, but the endless dark adds another layer of danger to the atmosphere. Like there's no source of light to guide you. Before it was feeling narrow, but now it's suffocating. Do you dare explore the streets for more resources in spite of the danger? Or do you simply make a break for the pathway to the historic society? The choice is yours, but the danger remains. Regardless, you eventually make your way to the museum, a rundown building that may contain some clues regarding the history of the town. But out of all the museum's contents, only one thing matters to James. A portrait of Pyramid Head, surrounded by corpses hung by their necks in cages. This image seems to portray a mass execution of some sort, and it clearly has something to do with James. But what could it possibly mean? Perhaps it'll make more sense later. James continues through the museum until he finds himself faced with a descending tunnel, and as he goes down, a low but loud horn repeatedly sounds until he reaches the door at the bottom of the path. And what makes it so disturbing is that the descending pathway is long. Very, very, very long. Nothing but that haunting horn blowing repeatedly as you make your way down. Some people have theorized that it could be a foghorn of a boat that disappeared beneath the lake, but it can also be interpreted as a warning that James is about to enter an extremely dark and horrifying place. Almost like James is about to see some of Silent Hill's darkest secrets buried deep beneath the earth. You really get the feeling that you're about to discover something deeply terrifying. Or maybe we're walking down to a deeper side of James' psyche. It's a punishingly dark sequence that keeps you on the edge of your seat, leaving you dreading what's coming next. The uncertainty of what's about to happen, what you might find, how it feels like you're being dragged down into a torturous, decaying realm. It's a spine-chilling sequence that just feels wrong the further down you go. But after a really long walk, you finally reach the bottom, and it's revealed that it was a long descending pathway into a prison. At first you might not make much of this place. It may appear rusty, but it's obviously because of how old and abandoned it is. But progressively, it gets worse and worse. First, there's the anxiety-inducing music. Then there's an elevator where you're trapped inside with killer cockroaches. And then we reunite with Eddie, who got his hands on a gun. And he seems to be going crazy and killing random people for no reason other than assuming they were making fun of him. This is a really unsettling encounter. The last time we saw Eddie, he was a harmless bum. Now he's suddenly talking about casually killing people. He even tries to cover it up by saying he was already dead when he got here when he literally told us he killed him. He tries shifting the blame by saying he made me do it, which could hint to his mentality from a lifetime of bullying. But the way he tries to deny doing anything wrong is really messed up, and it draws attention to our first meeting with him, where he denies killing the guy in the fridge. Pretty sure that was him and he was vomiting from the shock. The way he brushes off murdering an innocent person as not a big deal shows that he's clearly deranged, which makes his character a whole lot scarier with the way he was portrayed up to this point. Was he really just good at hiding his psychopathy? Or did his violent tendencies start to escalate the further he got into the town? James tries to explain to him that killing people is wrong, but he talks to him like he's a child learning a basic concept, demonstrating how concerned and anxious he's starting to feel about Eddie. It actually makes for an interesting contrast when you notice a certain detail with the other two cutscenes he was in. During their first meeting and their encounter in the bowling alley, James was always in a dominant position over Eddie, always standing over him while Eddie was kneeling or sitting to appear beneath James. Eddie also had his back turned on James, never directly facing him or making proper eye contact. But in this cutscene, the opposite occurs. This time Eddie is making direct eye contact with James, facing him, standing straight up, trying to make himself stand taller to be dominant over James, sort of like he's standing his ground against a bully. This time, James is the one in a vulnerable position, and he appears genuinely scared of Eddie. His level of aggression rising throughout the conversation really comes across as him getting crazier. It actually makes you wonder how long he was sitting there, silent in the dark after killing a guy. Even when he walks out of the room and says, "Yeah," he doesn't even sound scared or nervous. He says it with a lot of confidence, like he's scoffing this encounter as an inconvenience to him. This is actually really impressive. In a series filled with monsters, supernatural beings, and haunted environments, Silent Hill 2 managed to make some fat guy really intimidating and unsettling. Eddie at this point is an unpredictable ticking time bomb that could go off at any moment. It's even enough to scare James, who up to this point had a pretty average and dismissive reaction to the horrors he experiences. If you look closely, you can see his eye contact breaking and shifting to Eddie's gun, demonstrating his caution and trying to stay alert. This is arguably the first time in the game he demonstrates any real semblance of fear. And it's not with any of the monsters or dark buildings he explores. It's with Eddie, a human being. There's so many delicate details in this cutscene that escalate the terror and how menacing Eddie is becoming. Not just the tone in how James and Eddie speak to each other, but the body language and facial expressions. Every expression on Eddie's face really shows the player how twisted and insane he's getting, as it does for James in demonstrating his dread. And this taking place in Toluca Prison is just another level of messed up, a place of danger and death. And here we have Eddie becoming dangerous and ready to kill without a hint of hesitation. This is psychological horror personified to a T. No loud music, no dramatic cinematography, no jump scares, just a deep dive into the deteriorating state of a person's mind. And now we're deep in the heart of the prison, arguably the most disturbing location in the game. If the hospital is the hardest combat-wise, the prison is the most disgusting on a visual level. Nothing but decay, death, darkness, and rot. There's something about this place that's just deeply disgusting, like you're walking through a deeply messed up piece of the town's history. Probably the first detail to note is how James spends so much time going down and down and down. The pathway to the prison is meant to lead to the Labyrinth, and in order to get there, James has to walk down an extremely dark hallway descending beneath the Earth's surface, jump down 5 holes of unknown depth, and then take a minute-long elevator going straight down. The fear and anxiety that builds up the further James goes into the earth is really massive. Like ever since he arrived at the museum, it's been nothing but a one-way trip down to a hellish place, diving deeper and deeper into the root of evil, in a forgotten, decadent, and ruined place. Damp corridors, rotting hallways, echoes of pain and suffering in the dark. Remember that bloody message from earlier talking about a hole? This could have been the hole the message was referring to. The entire pathway from the History Society to the Labyrinth is just one huge hole down. You feel as if you might never see the surface again, doomed to wander this abandoned prison until you die of starvation. And you'd think that would be bad enough, but it's made even worse by the revolting atmosphere of the prison. The music that plays during this part of the game isn't even music, it's just noise. Pounding prison bars, banging metal, distorted chimes, creaking wooden doors, broken bells, a low growling beast, swarming insects, scrapping concrete, the ticking of an old clock, hollowing winds in an empty tunnel, droning sirens, nothing but distorted sound effects reflecting how putrid this place is. It almost feels like it's a reflection of James' mental health, slowly losing his grip on reality as you see the inside of his brain. We could be going into the darkest corners of his mind, progressively getting more loud and threatening. And if it's this bad for James, you can only imagine the kind of terrible suffering that occurred here. It actually feels haunted, wondering about this place possessed by the ghosts of the prisoners who met a horrifying end down here. The environment of this place is suffocating and aggressive, almost as if you're experiencing the suffering of the prisoners. Just the idea of people being left to rot down here, begging for mercy while in constant agony. The more time you spend down here, the more unsettling it gets. The vibes are purely sinister with endless negative energy, invoking an extreme level of paranoia. It's dark, taunting, and condescending, reflecting the feeling of being completely trapped in the dark. Sometimes it feels as if the prison is completely separated from the rest of the world. You're not just entering an abandoned prison, but another world entirely. This place leaves you in constant fear. Like at this point the game is just throwing random shit at you to mess with your mind. It's actually so gruesome that you begin to wonder if it's even a real place. Is it an actual prison, a creation of the town, or just James effectively losing his mind, wandering an abandoned building in a fit of psychosis? After braving through the prison, James finds himself in the Labyrinth, a maze-like construct deep beneath Silent Hill. And the music here really feels like you just traveled into the deep depths of a cursed place. All that build-up to be met with this distorted tunnel-like audio, it captures a sensation of losing hope, like there's only so much more of the madness you can take. Eventually it turns into a growling noise, resembling a giant creature or a T-Rex, almost like something is about to come out and devour you. Is this really a construct of James' mind? How can he come up with something this rotten and messed up? It looks and sounds like repressed negative emotion, held in for so long that now it's found a way to escape his head. It only further supports the idea that this labyrinth and the long pathway leading to it were all constructs of James' mind. All this time he was going deeper and deeper into his subconscious, unveiling all those feelings and thoughts he kept repressed. What could be causing this? Why would this be his inner mind? What happened to James to make his mental state devolve like this? Does the answer lie deeper inside? As we proceed deeper to find out, we're met with a shocking surprise. Maria's alive and waiting for James inside a cell. Now for those of us who played Born from a Wish, it was pretty obvious she was gonna come back. But remember, this was something that wasn't released until months later. Many people's first experience with Silent Hill 2 was the PS2 version released at launch. So imagine being someone back in 2001 going through the labyrinth with no prior knowledge of Maria's true identity. And upon reaching this jail cell, you were met with this shocking image. How is Maria here? How is she alive? Why does she have no recollection of being killed? All these questions rush through your mind, trying to make sense of what the hell's going on. But for Maria, this is all according to plan because it makes it easier for her to mess with James. She tries seducing him again, this time with much more effective mannerisms. For many people, this is the most important scene in the game. It reveals to the player Maria's true nature, her intentions and how effective she is at warping James' psyche. She starts off by playing sweet and innocent, channeling Mary's sweet and loving nature that James remembers. She sounds genuinely concerned as she talks about James being forgetful, including forgetting a mysterious videotape in the hotel. The way she brings it up is really eerie when you notice the shift in tone. James notices she knows something that she shouldn't, so he asks her if she's Maria. That's when she gives him a really menacing look while saying, "I'm not your Mary," but then she quickly swifts back to being sweet and seductive. The way in which she quickly swifts into this false sense of kindness makes you question her intentions, and it invokes a feeling of her being an illusion, almost as if she's eluding you to a secret about James. But let's go back to that one line for a moment. When she scolds him for asking if she's Maria, the way in which she delivers this one line is really cold and short, especially when contrasted with the nice flirty tone she had before. The rest of the conversation she's being really friendly and warm, but that one line is said with a heavy feeling of contempt and resentment. She comes across as really angry and direct, almost to the point you can perceive it as a threat. You could interpret this as her saying, "I'm not your dead wife, and I'm getting sick of you acting like I'm just a replacement for her." It just sounds really spiteful and jealous, with a hint of irritation that none of her attempts to charm him have worked, and that irritation is reaching a boiling point. Up to this point she's been playing nice, but now she's showing a darker side of herself. You can just feel the negative aura creeping out of Maria as she says that line. The delivery is simple yet really sharp and strict. You sort of get the sensation Maria's taunting him, like she's saying, "Mary's dead. You can forget about her because I'm the closest you're ever gonna get to her again." Plus, there's something really unsettling about the way her face is lit up, almost like it's demonic. And then she tries to act all sweet and innocent. That is some really devious stuff, and it highlights the most disturbing detail in this scene, how Maria is playing two personalities. Throughout this encounter, she shifts between acting like Mary and being herself to play off James' desires and delusions. She starts off acting like Mary, cheerful and loving, then to herself when ridiculing James. James, then back to Mary to try and satisfy him, and then back to herself trying to seduce him. She subtly places her hand on his cheek, assuring him that she's indeed real. This is when we finally see Maria's true nature in full display, switching between Mary and herself, making you realize she's nothing but a demon created to taunt and confuse James. The psychological game she plays on him by switching between two distinct personalities, mixed with the lighting of the room and the gestures she makes with her body, it's really calculating in a subtle way. She's like a sweet fantasy slowly morphing into a hideous nightmare, disguised in human flesh. She perfectly channels the memories of another person to further manipulate James, to the point that it actually ends up working on some level. He never takes a moment to question if she's real, as Maria's the only one bringing it up. He's actually convincing himself Maria's a real person, and he doesn't even realize it's happening. Maria manages to manipulate him and play off of him perfectly, fully displaying her duality with Mary while also keeping that part of herself hidden from him. It's like her mind game is so effective that it's hidden from James in plain sight. You really get the feeling that she's a poisonous influence trying to escape his mind by torturing his psyche. The way she's presented in this scene actually makes the power of the town much scarier. It's not using an illusion or a hallucination or even a supernatural creature to taunt James at this point. Silent Hill has the power to create a fully sentient human being, and perfectly mirrors his loved one in the form of a separate person, a complete stranger who looks and sounds like someone you know. It's an incredibly unsettling and deceptive detail that elevates the threat Maria poses over James, and it's made even better by the fantastic lighting. The way it illuminates her face while concealing her eyes makes her look really mysterious and haunting. It adds so much to the feeling that you get from listening to her talk. Look at how sinister she is with those heavily shadowed eyes, giving you the impression she's not what she seems. She expertly conveys a sense of devious and demented distraction, wanting James to never process his grief and just embrace the false comfort she provides him. And it seems to be taking effect. The way he acts after she touches him is really creepy. He's completely under her charm like a possessed puppet. And part of what makes it so effective is that we, the audience, are just as confused as James. We have no idea why Maria's acting like this or what she's trying to do. Yet her behavior is so entrancing that you feel fascinated by it. It's like Maria's aware of what he's going through, switching between all these different behaviors to make him spiral further into insanity, and she does it so quickly that it's practically seamless, switching from upbeat and caring to bewitching and seductive, demonstrating both who Mary was and what James wanted her to be, feeding off his basic desires through authentic dialogue and delivery, and the voice work just makes it so much more sinister. She perfectly fluctuates through all these emotions without being over the top and maintaining the naturalism in her delivery. It emits so much anxiety around her duality, adding to the sense that something about her is really malevolent. The fact that this is a game from 2001 yet they managed to make this scene look and feel so real is sensationally creepy. Every single aspect of this scene is perfect, from the voice acting to the body language to the dialogue to the faint music to the pacing to the way it's shot to the lighting effects to the venomous personality of Maria. I cannot think of a single way they could have made this better, painting a perfect image for Maria as a villain and an obstacle for James to overcome his grief. So following this mesmerizing scene, James tries to look for a way to get her out of the cell. While further navigating the labyrinth, he comes across a doorway with a bloody newspaper on the ground. It seems to detail the mysterious murder of a man, but some of the writing is faded out from the blood. And as James walks into the next hallway, he hears the horrifying shriek of Angela crying for help, pleading for her dad to not hurt her. And here's the part where I put up a trigger warning because this is what I believe to be the most sickening moment in the game. Why? Well, you'll see in just a moment. James follows the sound of Angela crying for help, entering a grotesque room with walls made of flesh. Along the walls are a series of orifices, with some sort of object penetrating them. We see Angela curled in a corner as a hideous creature emerges from the floor. This is the third boss fight. It's actually a pretty quick one if you use the shotgun properly. The monster will die after about 6 to 7 shots depending on what difficulty you're playing on. But that's not the sickening part. The sickening part is what happens after you kill it. James tries to comfort Angela, who immediately goes to kick the corpse of the monster while throwing a TV on it. And this is where we learn that the monster is a manifestation of Angela's memories of her dad. So, honestly, there's no way to sugarcoat it. Angela was repeatedly raped by her father as a kid. So yeah, those holes in the wall with objects penetrating them. Like I said, the most sickening part of the game. James tries to comfort her, but Angela retaliates by forcing him back, making some really sexist accusations towards him. It's pretty clear that her experiences with her father caused her to develop a hatred of men. She could just be speaking through her trauma, and I wouldn't blame her because everything about this part of the game is really fucked up. It could even be that she views the boss battle as two males fighting over a female, and she may perceive James as a monster in human form. You can tell just from her tone that this deeply hurts her. Just the idea she'd have to face her father again after everything he put her through would leave her petrified. She even ridicules James for trying to help her, because he can't help her and they both know it. Angela's trauma with her father has affected her so deeply that his death isn't even of any solace to her. All the happiness in life just looks like it was sucked out of her. In spite of how valiant James is in his efforts to rescue and protect her, you can't kill a memory with guns, especially memories that are so foul and tainted with evil. You can also tell that she feels guilt about what happened to her, and she was brought to Silent Hill to deal with that guilt. But why would Silent Hill allow James to see Angela's trauma if it's supposed to be different with each individual? Or it could be that it was deliberate. Maybe he's able to see her other world because she was so traumatized and frozen with horror that she couldn't face her own demons. Maybe deep down she was calling for help, allowing James to see it so he can help her. But how would you expect Angela to face something like this? She was subjected to one of the top 3 worst things that can happen to a child, with no hope of escape resulting in severe PTSD. Her childhood was literally a living hell. Out of all the scenes in the game, this one is by far the least subtle, so in your face about what happened to Angela, but I think that works better by making it so much more shocking. Even the TV manages to have meaning to it. It could have been something that she used to distract herself from the abuse and trauma. This scene is a perfect example of how horror can be revolting without resorting to on-screen gore or graphic scenarios. At first you don't know what the monster in the room are supposed to represent, but once you figure it out, it sucker punches you in a way that leaves you feeling sick. This is one of my favorite scenes in not just Silent Hill 2, but the survival horror genre as a whole for how unapologetically straightforward it is. This scene doesn't pull any punches with how it portrays a person's trauma through sexual abuse, and it's done in a way that doesn't exploit what happened to Angela. It just shows how what was done to her affected her so deeply. This is how you show disturbing content without doing it for the sake of titillation, by having respect and a mature understanding of the subject matter. After Angela leaves the room, James tries to find his way to Maria, but after finding his way to the cell, he sees that he's too late. Something killed her, and now she's lying on the bed lifeless with blood staining the mattress. And this leaves James devastated. He seeks redemption by thinking he can save someone instead of failing like he did for Mary, and yet he's denied the satisfaction again. He's left confused but also broken. He's just become so tired of the constant suffering he's going through. He just wants to be free of all this. He wants it to end, but it just keeps coming. So once again, he's left with nothing to do but continue his search. He eventually gets out of the labyrinth but finds himself in a graveyard. In the upper left corner, there's 3 holes lined up with tombstones, and if you take the time to inspect them, they display a really shocking detail. For the names of Eddie, Angela, and James are all written on the tombstones. Are they dead? Are they about to die? Is Silent Hill trying to warn them about something? This is getting really freaky. Going down one of the holes, you find yourself in some sort of freezer area. And who else do we run into but Eddie? And this time he's gone off the deep end. So here's where things get interesting. Remember that football and those posters in the room next to where you first met him? Throughout his life, Eddie was subjected to harassment for his appearance, ever since his earlier years attending school. And there were times where the harassment got really severe, to the point that he was on his knees begging for his life. This worsened his already bad state by making him develop excessive eating and body dysmorphia. And you might be thinking, oh well, kids can be cruel. Maybe it got better for him after he finished school. Well, it didn't. Even after finishing school, he was still harassed by people around him, one particular being an all-star football player. This guy would continuously single out Eddie, engaging in harassing him in a targeted manner, and the harassment kept escalating until one day, something in Eddie snapped. In retaliation, he killed the football player's dog and then shot him in the knee, basically ending his career. For whatever reason, this invoked Eddie into running away, eventually leading him to Silent Hill. The room with the football was basically foreshadowing Eddie's past, and the manifestations of the town used to taunt and challenge him. It may also symbolize his desire to have a better physical appearance and escape the constant harassment he was subjected to. With all this in mind, it actually makes Eddie somewhat sympathetic. He didn't just get up one day and decide to kill people. He was subjected to targeted harassment by his peers his whole life. You can understand the pain he was going through, being different from others and being bullied for it. A lifetime that would drive anyone crazy. If you understood him better, he wouldn't seem so fucked up. There's actually real people who are similar to Eddie. People that have gone through so much shit that they just snapped at one point. While he did go off the deep end, it's still a shame that no one ever tried to talk to him or offer kindness. And that's the simultaneously tragic and disturbing thing about Eddie. He was a victim of genes and luck, being shunned for his looks and no one around him wanting to help. If someone had simply given him a hand, he could have gotten better. It's very telling that his version of Silent Hill was most likely built around the constant harassment, like he could have been facing monsters representing his attackers. So maybe he was telling the truth when he said he didn't kill anyone, at least not since coming to Silent Hill. After coming to town, he starts to see the monsters as people who harassed him. So all of his kills were actually monsters. As far as reality's concerned, he only killed the football player's dog. I actually feel bad that the harassment got to him to the point that he decided to take the worst decisions. Given his reaction to the guy in the fridge, Eddie did feel bad about what he was doing. Maybe it was just the town that finally got to him. Eddie was a well-meaning person until he finally snapped. The harassment was trapped in his head, like an endless chatter of voices of those who ridiculed him. The real tragedy of Eddie was that he never killed anyone before coming to Silent Hill, but his inability to confront his issues resulted in him relishing in his intrusive thoughts. Eddie is an example of what happens if you go to Silent Hill and don't find the truth in yourself. He ended up just surrendering to his own madness. You have to endure, or else your past will come back so many times that you end up going insane. Eddie is a character that can be seen as sad since he was harassed over and over and seen as useless by those around him, which made him feel trapped and helpless to the point that he felt the need to get revenge. He was forced to live a life of irrational judgment. No one tried to help him and he was forced to face it alone. Silent Hill didn't really consume or influence him. It simply brought out what was already there from a lifetime of pain, starting to see himself as a confident, self-assured serial killer. Eddie bragging about killing people and trying to kill James is actually him having a psychological meltdown. And the many camera angles on him while he's ranting really makes him look like a madman. And then when he says, "A corpse can't laugh," and the camera keeps still for a few seconds, you can see the exact moment that he loses it. I especially love the way he delivers that specific line, where his inflection goes from silly and clumsy to sinister and sneaky. It sounds like he's being possessed by another person, making his insanity disturbingly believable. The devious look in his eyes also details how much joy he's feeling, perfectly contrasting with how he broke eye contact with people in the beginning. This is an example of how Silent Hill doesn't necessarily punish the guilty. It's not a sapient deity passing judgment. It's a mindless supernatural force that projects and amplifies someone's psychological state. Eddie is tormented by his visions like Angela and James, and initially he's afraid, but eventually he starts to revel in the violence. He's legitimately lost any sense of sanity he had left and is now just a shambling husk of whatever he was before. His shift in personality is also reflected in his body language and tone. You can really feel the pain and anger in his words, expressing how a bullying victim can feel and how it can build up over time. The constant harassment got to him and scarred his psyche, more so than any physical injury. He commits acts of violence out of emotional pain, and the pain he carried made him violent. Remember that pizza from the bowling alley? The pizza he eats demonstrates how he views food as a coping mechanism, trying to indulge himself in delusion and pleasure instead of doing anything about his situation. In a sense, it feels like he ended up playing a role in his own destruction, giving in to temptation instead of resisting it, and his villainous side is demonstrated really well during the boss fight. The way he raises his gun the first time is really unsettling, like it really wasn't Eddie anymore that James was fighting. It was a deeper side of him that he was holding back for a long time, and now he's letting it all out. The music also perfectly represents the anger and wrath that Eddie feels, fully displaying his true colors for James to witness. It's pretty evident that he was starting a career as a serial killer before even coming to Silent Hill, which allowed him to live his violent fantasies to their fullest. The way he tells James we're not like other people has a really sadistic ring to it too. You can imagine him having a huge grin on his face when saying that. This is what makes Eddie so terrifying as a concept. A character who was initially established as comic relief is revealed to have a deeper and more corrupt outlook on life. At first he seemed harmless, with a relatively goofy attitude and appearance, and now he's gleefully rubbing his murderous tendencies in James' face. The game takes its time to subvert your expectations over the course of several hours instead of just doing it all at once with a plot twist, slowly revealing Eddie's true nature and how he surrenders to madness. The meat locker represents his cold detachment from the world, and the meat symbolizes his feelings of being judged as a piece of meat by those around him, while also viewing his bullies as meat to be slaughtered. We know from Angela that Silent Hill eventually turns a person's fears against them, so it's no surprise that Eddie's feelings of inadequacy and alienation would manifest as well. So this meat locker is his other world, giving James a small sample of how his mind has cracked. The low temperature of the freezer implies that Eddie's other world is bitter and cold, symbolizing his feelings of isolation and his rapidly vanishing conscience. The cold air also looks like it's being pumped into the room by a series of tubes and vents, showing how he feels that the cause of his torment is external and beyond his control, relentlessly surrounding him until he becomes cold and bitter as well. Unlike James, who seems to be suffering from a type of amnesia, Eddie recognizes the reality of the violence of what he did, but rather than feeling shame, he feels a justified rage in what he's done. It really shows how trapped Eddie is with no hope of escape. Even if he succeeded in killing James, he was still gonna face more problems in Silent Hill. Initially, he felt guilty and was driven down a road created from his past to make sense of it. He chose to embrace the illusion instead of facing reality. It's actually the most unnerving boss battle in the game. You see a guy who was bullied his entire life and the end result, and a lot of people wouldn't understand what makes him like this. When you really look at it, Eddie teaches us that everyone is a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. We are all equally capable of evil and giving into our baser instincts, choosing a path of self-destruction rather than healing. Eddie's story was almost like a battle against the rest of the world, fighting against the idea of what a person must be like to fit in. All he wanted was to be treated normally, to be accepted, to have friends and live a normal life, but was too wrapped up in a life of pent-up depression and anger, and in the end he lets those things consume him, finding peace in killing anyone he thinks is mocking him, blinding himself to his own arrogance. So now, James is left with no choice. He kills Eddie in the meat locker and processes the grief of killing a human being. But there's something wrong about the way he processes this information. He says a human being twice, and the second time he sounds calmer. Then he slowly turns towards the exit and says to himself, "Mary, did you really die 3 years ago?" But why is he asking himself this? Mary did die 3 years ago, didn't she? But here's where it really becomes scary. Throughout the game you have 2 items in your inventory, a photo of Mary and the letter calling James to Silent Hill. Up to this point, when examining the letter, you're able to see Mary's writing, but after killing Eddie, the writing vanishes, as if there was nothing written on the paper at all. What could this mean? Why is the paper blank? Could it be that killing Eddie awakened some sort of dormant truth inside of James, causing the writing to vanish? Eddie said Silent Hill called both of them for doing something terrible, to face the consequences for their actions. But at this point, all we know about James is that he's in Silent Hill because he received a letter from his wife, a message from beyond the grave. On a surface level, he's wondering if his wife is still alive, but deep down, what he's really asking is if she died 3 years ago or if something else happened. And even deeper within him, he might already know the answer. The way in which he calls out James for having blood on his hand shows you that Eddie recognizes a reality that James doesn't. Eddie was actually essential to the story by revealing a truth that James was hiding from. But what exactly is this truth? What is James hiding from? The answers just might be in the Lakeview Hotel, the final setting of this perilous quest. James exits the building and finds himself back on the surface in spite of all the time he spent going down. So all that time in the historic society and prison really was a descent into his mind. At this point he's just going down a rabbit hole, delving deeper and deeper into himself. He knows he's at rock bottom, and that there's nowhere else to go except deeper into the town to find the truth. He gets into a rowboat, travels across the lake, and eventually arrives at the hotel. And the moment the player enters the building, you can just feel the coldness emitting from this place. The hotel looks normal, yet it's also sterile and empty. The atmosphere is mysterious, creepy, and cumulative, almost like the hotel is trying to suffocate you with its emptiness. And the music is really paralyzing. In spite of it sounding quiet and soft, it makes you feel scared of what's coming up. A tiny chime accompanied by a constant slow beating noise, almost like a weak heartbeat. It creates a sinking feeling in your stomach that makes you feel nauseous, like it's building up to something horrible. The music gives the sensation that exploring the hotel leads to a terrifying truth, and you question if you even want to keep going to know what it is. Yet in spite of that feeling, you know that you've already come too far to turn back now. You pick up a map of the hotel next to the entrance, with the words waiting for you written on it. It's almost like Mary is mocking you to come find her, if she's even in the hotel at all. As you explore the hotel, we come across a little surprise in the dining room. It's Laura hiding behind a piano, and there's something different about her. Instead of acting hostile towards James, she seems to be more friendly and helpful. She seems to be more sympathetic and lenient towards James and understands him better. In spite of their constant fighting, they're the same. 2 wandering souls looking for the ghost of a person they knew. You really get the feeling they're starting to connect over something, and that's when she gives James a really important clue. A letter from Mary detailing how they became friends, with Mary wishing her a happy 8th birthday. And that's when Laura tells James she turned 8 last week. This is a huge revelation because it directly contradicts Mary dying from her disease 3 years ago. So what exactly is it? Did she die 3 years ago? Did she die more recently? Or it may just be possible that Mary's really alive. A lot of stuff goes on through your head as you try to process this. Is it a moment of hope? Or a cruel trick? At this point, it could be anything. But I think what's more important is how it helps to flesh out Laura's character and her practical purpose in the plot. She's the only one who doesn't suffer from any trauma, so there's really no reason for her to be in Silent Hill. And since she's a kid who can't fully grasp the severity of the situation, she wouldn't be forced to confront any monsters or demons. Her only connection to Mary is that she views her as the daughter she and James never got to have. Maybe in the time they were friends, Laura saw her as a mother figure, and the reason she resents James is because he doesn't spend a lot of time with her. But in spite of this, Mary's last wish was for the two to get along. And so, Laura offers to hear James' side of the story. She holds a special connection with Mary, and through that she has a connection with James. You might have noticed by now that each of the human characters James comes across reflects his inner turmoil and reason for being in Silent Hill. Eddie represents the madness he feels as his delusions get worse. Angela represents the guilt he feels over Mary's death. And Laura represents his determination in searching for her. Angela and Eddie are like James, individuals with a grim past who begin to reach the point of lunacy and despair, which results in them being called to Silent Hill. They also represent two sides of him that unfold throughout the game, his psychopathy and depression. So what is it that Laura represents? Well, Laura seems to represent James' innocence. He was brought to the town to be punished for a wrongdoing. But does this wrongdoing make him a bad person? That can't possibly be true because throughout the game, James performs multiple acts of heroism and kindness. In the case of Angela, he sympathizes with her and helps her through her depression. He talks her out of thoughts of self-harm, protects her from her memories of her father, and he listens to her venting her baser thoughts, never judging her negatively. James gave Angela something no one else would: compassion. Her entire life was filled with torment and misery, and her interactions with James give her a sense of comfort. Even if there's nothing he can do to help her heal, he was still there for her and helped her through Silent Hill. In the case of Eddie, it's a bit different, but it still has elements of goodness. For one thing, James is the only person Eddie meets that doesn't make fun of him for his appearance. He shows concern for his well-being, and is capable of having a friendly conversation with him. And in the prison, he cautiously but gently tries to talk Eddie out of killing people. And even during their final confrontation, he tries to convince Eddie that he needs help. Throughout the game, there's never a moment where he acts selfishly, and he shows that he genuinely cares about the well-being of others. Laura is a reflection of the good within James, and how he can choose a path of absolution at the end of the game. It also brilliantly shows how the three characters signify the tone of the three main endings. Does James surrender to his delusions like Eddie? Does he succumb to his guilt like Angela? Or does he heal and move on like Laura? This is why she doesn't appear in the other two endings, because James will either be consumed by guilt or reject the reality of what he's done. She offers James a sense of guidance, to avoid taking either of these routes. Laura was called to Silent Hill to serve a role in James' journey, to help him accept responsibility and recognize the truth. She ultimately represents the possibility of James finding peace, even if the answers aren't what he was hoping for. But after Laura runs off to find a letter she forgot, James is once again left to wander the hotel on his own. After getting through a series of puzzles, he finds the videotape Maria mentioned from before. James makes his way to the 3rd floor and enters the hotel room, but when James walks inside, there's no one there. Mary is nowhere to be found. But there seems to be a TV of some kind, with a VHS player hooked to it. Maybe if James plays the tape, it'll show him something. He puts the tape in the player, turns the TV on, and is shown the truth. And this is where we get the horrifying, pulse-pounding revelation the game was building up to. James killed Mary by suffocating her with a pillow during the last days of her illness. To say this moment was shocking wouldn't even begin to describe it. The game just threw the last expected outcome right at us, leaving us to process the unimaginable information alongside James. When you play through the game the first time, you wouldn't expect this kind of twist. Somehow you imagine maybe Mary's still alive, or maybe there's something supernatural about her. But then you see the videotape and can't believe what you just witnessed. After all the time we spent getting invested in this character, this was like a mallet to the chest. It's actually so horrific that a part of you thinks it could just be a trick. Maybe some kind of hallucination. Maybe a fabricated memory created by the town. But then you realize you're doing the same thing James did. Hiding from the truth and lying to yourself about what happened. He didn't want to acknowledge the fact that he killed her, so he blocked out the memory of doing it. The power of the town forced him to remember and face it. This can only mean one thing. James saying how Mary died 3 years ago at the start of the game was a coping mechanism he invented through his trauma, showing how much his reality has been warped and how far he was deluding himself. In reality, Mary's death was really recent. James just killed her a few days ago. And just like that, so many other things throughout the game suddenly make sense in the worst way imaginable. The hospital and the prison were both symbolic of what was going on in James' mind when he killed Mary. The hospital is a manifestation of how he felt trapped, or imprisoned in the hospital while his wife was hooked up to machines. That's what all those breathing sounds were. That was Mary, barely alive. James wanted it to all end. The prison is a manifestation of the potential consequences of his actions. James must have had nightmares about going to prison for what he did, and Silent Hill showed him what he could suffer. And that radio message from the beginning of the game, that was Mary talking to James, asking him why he killed her. And then there's all those dead bodies James comes across throughout the game. The one in front of the TV, the ones in the streets, the ones that he supposedly killed, all of them were copies of James, reflecting his belief that he deserves to die for what he did. There's also so many moments of irony and foreshadowing in his interactions with other characters. James telling Angela there's always another way despite his self-loathing. James telling Eddie he's gone nuts for killing people when he killed his wife. James condemning Laura for lying despite that he was lying to himself throughout the whole game. James telling Maria to not be ridiculous when she suggests he hated Mary. Angela accusing him of not wanting her around anymore. Eddie telling James not to get holy on him because the town called him too. Laura scolding James for not loving Mary. Maria taunting him in the hospital about not being able to find her. In every one of these encounters, he's instantly defensive to not recall what he's done. All the signs were there, and now it's hitting you like a truck. All this time, James was in denial of what he did. By trying to push the truth away, he only brought more attention to it. It was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. He tried to deny it and run, but now he can no longer run away. The foreshadowing in this game is so heavy that it feels more like a plot turn than a twist, and it perfectly recontextualizes so many things that happened, making replaying the game and picking up the signs really rewarding. Even the monsters make more sense now. They were all trying to kill him because they represent his subconscious guilt and were trying to fulfill it, wishing to die for what he's done. This is why the memo became blank. Killing a human being awakened a memory that was resting dormant in James. The letter was a fabrication by Silent Hill to draw James out. And the build-up to this moment is so authentic and in tune with James' behavior throughout the game. He went into a psychotic episode when he killed his wife, detaching himself from reality, and at the same time it was so horrific that his mind blocked it from access. This is why he appeared in Silent Hill, to find something that was lost to him, a sense of regret. One creepy detail that you see before James kills Mary is that he kisses her on the forehead. The most logical opinion is that he's doing it out of sympathy, to put an end to her suffering. But it also shows how he was very calm, collected and affectionate right before suffocating her. There was no emotional reaction as he did this. He was just stone cold. That is really messed up. At this point, it's practically an act of betrayal against the player. We liked James. We wanted to see him find Mary. We were acting as his guide, helping him navigate all the dangers in Silent Hill. And all this time, he was the one who killed Mary. It's so shocking and heartbreaking and even creates feelings of resentment towards him. The cinematography is also incredible, coupled with that model of James just slouching over the chair, staring at the floor while the camera circles around him. It manages to convey so emotion with just that one shot of the camera spinning around him without saying a word. The gravity of this revelation is so heavy that James just sits in silence, just feeling completely defeated. At this point, nothing matters to him anymore. The world around him has completely disappeared from his senses. There's no Silent Hill, no Lakeview Hotel, no Laura, no Maria, no monsters, not even the chair he's sitting on. The only thing that exists in this moment is James and his own thoughts. He doesn't move a muscle, just staying there like a statue. That moment of motionless silence resonates so strongly that even the player feels affected by it. It's like the developers know this is shocking you to your core and you need time to process the information. A lot of video games these days just go 100% forward with the plot. always moving forward, trying to get to the next story beat as soon as possible. But Silent Hill 2 doesn't do that, because it respects you as a player, giving you the time to feel things before moving on with the story. It respects your feelings and wants you to contemplate them before moving on. This is what makes Silent Hill 2 a masterpiece of writing. A plot twist that hits you hard because of how it's presented and the sheer emotional investment involved. This is actually the creepiest scene in the game. It's not a jump scare or a confrontation with the monsters or any of the characters. It's just the cold, agonizing truth. James wasn't innocent. He was a killer. And Silent Hill called him out to face that in a step-by-step manner. First, he faced the delusion of Mary being alive. Then, he faced the monsters. Then, he faced his lies that he sold to himself and others. Then, he faced the pain of being reminded of what he did. Until finally, he was shown something he could no longer hide from. The hotel room looks so normal, contrary to everything else in the game. And yet, this is the room that invokes the most horror in the main character. As he absorbs the reality of what he's done, he feels sick, with his mind collapsing on itself. It's the actual human reactions and emotional backing of a man coming to terms with his crime. This scene proves that Silent Hill isn't just another horror franchise. It's a collection of psychological problems combined with esoteric meanings, the union of the human mind and perception, mixed with a supernatural background. And it's all these elements that make this revelation one of the best in not just video games, but storytelling as an art form. It's not just the twist itself, it's everything that happened in Silent Hill 2 prior to it. The build-up, getting invested in James' character, the solid pacing and character interactions, the foreshadowing, the symbolism, the music, the atmosphere, all of it was essential to the gravity of this twist and how it impacts James. It was very carefully presented in a delicate manner instead of throwing it in your face out of nowhere. This is basically the plot of the game. James is in a hell of his own making for what he did, and he has no way out until he faces it. And the most brilliant part about it is that it isn't even the end of the game. You have to keep playing with the knowledge you have now, left to decide if you still care about James or want to help him. Even the music that plays during this scene is perfection. It fully captures the experience of an awful truth catching up to you, giving off the feeling of all the horrible, selfish things you've done. And now you're being judged for it by something that you can't comprehend. It's just empty. It makes you feel hollow and gutted inside, just like James. It also demonstrates all the feelings that James has for himself: hatred, guilt, sorrow, pain, despair, loneliness, helplessness. It even captures the anger and sorrow Laura feels while she's bashing him. And James doesn't even do anything to rationalize or justify what he did. He just tells her the truth. And they're both left with the harsh reality that Mary's gone. Laura, unable to spare any more anger, leaves the room, and possibly Silent Hill, leaving James to confront the truth alone. But it's not over yet. James hears Mary calling out to him on the radio. But is it really Mary? Is it just James having another psychotic episode? He gets up, walks out of the room, and finds the hotel has been burned down and left to decay. Before, the hotel looked normal, just as he left it with Mary because it was part of his delusion. But now that he's seen the truth, the hotel's true form is revealed to him, rotten and flooded, because the illusion has been stripped away and reality is now crashing down on him. James fully realizes Mary is gone, and it's time for him to move on. It emits a really depressing and soul-draining feeling as you have to keep moving forward despite what was just revealed. The music sounds really distorted, conveying James accepting the cruel reality of his situation. This is where the game goes into full depression mode, with everything falling apart around James. At this point, Silent Hill has given up maintaining any sense of reality, making you bask in the cold realization of why you're here. As you explore the ruins of the hotel, you can come across a reading room and find a possible optional conversation between James and Mary's doctor. James becomes short and argumentative with the doctor, lashing at him for failing to cure Mary. The doctor tells him that at most, Mary has 3 years left to live. Now there's actually a lot of people who played this game and never found this scene, making it one of Silent Hill 2's biggest secrets. Understandable, as it's pretty easy to miss, but when coupled with the rest of the game, it becomes one of the most important scenes in the entire story. The doctor tells James that Mary has 3 years left, so in his psychotic episode, this is where he got the idea that she died 3 years ago. But an even more important detail is the tone and inflection of James' voice. James is extremely short about Mary's disease, demanding a solution to her illness. He shows genuine concern about Mary's health and is distraught about no hope for a cure. An interesting contrast to the twist we just witnessed. He's quickly hysterical upon getting the news, quickly going in denial about the situation. But when he asks about the time Mary has left, his tone shifts to monotone and depressed. If you listen closely, you can hear the exact moment his mind snaps. This is actually the most normal that James has sounded throughout the entire game. We get a glimpse into what kind of person he was before the events of the story, maybe even before Mary fell ill. And his very real concern over Mary is fascinating. In spite of what we just learned about him, this scene shows that James genuinely loved and cared about Mary. He didn't want her to die and was desperate to find a way to save her. So if that's the case, what led him to killing Mary? Was it really an act of mercy, to put an end to her suffering? It's actually a real shame that a lot of people don't know about this scene because it's a vital element of the story. Not only does it add an additional layer to James' character, but it also recontextualizes so many things about his relationship with Mary and the ending. And it actually demonstrates how Guy Seehee was the perfect person to represent the character. Here's a fun fact for ya. Around the time of the game's production, Guy was actually going through a pretty bad divorce. It led to him having feelings of depression and self-harm. I think it's pretty telling that Guy was incorporating what he was feeling during the divorce into his performance. Knowing this makes the voice acting of James so much more authentic. Guy was able to realistically emote the emotions of a man lost in depression after his marriage came to a sad end. And he did it using personal experience. It's so profound and moving that I really can't imagine someone else doing the role of this character with this information in mind. It just adds a whole new level of emotion to the experience. As the player makes their way through the hotel, they find the building is leaking with water, and the basement is also flooded. This is meant to signify James drowning in his sorrow, his tears trying to consume him. The scenery and the music together really transmits the feeling of guilt, making you feel horrible just like James. His entire reality has been shattered, and now he's just wandering aimlessly towards the end. But before he gets there, we have one last encounter with Angela. We see her in a burning staircase engulfed in flames, observing a fleshy portrait on the wall. She sees James and confuses him with her mom, right before realizing it's not her. She thanks James for rescuing her, but a part of her wishes he didn't, telling him that she deserved the abuse like her mother told her. Asking if James can save her and heal her pain, she's only met with silence. She slowly turns around, acknowledging that James is able to feel the heat of the flames like she can. She tells him it's always like this and walks up the flaming staircase, never to be seen again. This is the single saddest sequence that I've ever witnessed in a video game, just leaving me feeling completely empty and helpless every time I see it. At this point you understand that Angela's beyond healing. There's nothing that anyone can do for her. The severity of what was done to her was so deep and revolting that she's completely dead on the inside. During your first playthrough, it's really unlikely that you'll fully grasp the weight of what was done to her. But once you put everything together, it becomes the most depressing storyline in video games. In the beginning, she was exactly like James, looking for her missing mom, her only remaining comfort and warmth after everything she was subjected to. But in the end, she comes to the sad revelation that even her mother didn't care about her. The only tie to what little comfort she had left was gone. And now her only warmth in life is the constant fire that surrounds her, living in constant anguish. It's really apparent that the reason she was looking for her mom was because she was gonna kill her, and then she was gonna kill herself. Notice the way she says this line. You're the only one left, then finally I'll be able to rest. She holds resentment towards her mom for allowing the abuse to happen and then telling her she deserved it. And that's the most sickening part. Her mother was in a position to help her, but she never did anything to stop the abuse. She ignored the screams, the pain that her daughter was suffering, and then she made it worse by telling Angela she deserved it. It wasn't enough that Angela endured years of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her father and brother. She also had to suffer psychological abuse by her mother. That is just as evil as committing the abuse yourself. Trying to convince a victim that they somehow drove their abuser to do what they did is just vile. Angela's mother was a monster too, just not in a way that was immediately apparent. If Angela had just let go of what her mother said to her and realized that James killing her father was her getting a second chance, she might have been motivated to go with him and leave Silent Hill. Maybe he'd be able to find her a doctor to help her start a new life and come to terms with her abuse. But she wasn't even given the decency of finding peace. The physical abuse of her father and brother only matched by the mental abuse of her mother. Her version of Silent Hill must have been 10 times worse than anything James went through. Her father raped her brother helped him, and her mother let them get away with it out of some twisted jealousy. All of Angela's family were purely evil, and they deserved the worst fate after death, belonging in a place far worse than Silent Hill. Angela's mother was the last loose end of her past tying her to this world, the last remnants of the horror she suffered. Her objective was to put an end to everyone and everything involved in her pain, including herself. It's like the torment won't end until everyone is dead. And what makes it even sadder is that this is partially our fault. We indirectly caused this to happen by killing her demons in her stead. By saving her, James and the player just reaffirmed Angela's feelings that she was weak and can't fight her own battles, thereby adding to her self-loathing. We thought we were rescuing her, but we weren't supposed to do that. A reoccurring theme in Silent Hill 2 is that the only person who can save someone from their trauma is themselves. Eddie, Angela, and even James, depending on the ending you get, all die because they couldn't overcome their demons. This is meant to depict the very real dilemma of those who suffer trauma. You can offer them all the guidance and help that you can, but in the end, only they can choose to reach out and take your hand. The only person who can save them is themselves. Unfortunately, as in the case in real life, not everyone has the strength to reach out and overcome what haunts them. Silent Hill is trying to teach you a lesson, and the price for failing to learn that lesson is death. That was Angela's downfall. She couldn't face her own demons, and in turn, they consumed her. Her victimized state is nowhere near her fault, but it's in her hands to heal and change. Even though her family is dead, the impact on her still lives. She needed to kill the monster, face up to her demons, and know that while they can't hurt her anymore, others may try. She had to learn that not everyone is ill intent, but simultaneously recognize if someone's trying to hurt her. But her scream for help ended up reaching James, signifying that she was too broken to face it herself. So since she's unable to come to grips with what happened, Silent Hill offers her another means to escape: the embrace of death. It really doesn't help that from the way she says "even Mama said it," it implies that she was looking to her mom for help. But instead, she only condemned her for someone else's depravity, which finally caused her to snap, driving her to kill her family, burn the house down, and run away in guilt and shame. Angela was justified in killing them, but the abuse left its mark on her in such a way that she couldn't recognize that. She ends up paying the consequences of someone else's action she had no control over, making the situation so soul-crushingly sad. Angela is the only character in the game who was truly the victim of her circumstance. That's what makes it so depressing. Her fate is completely unfair and she truly deserves better because she did nothing wrong. Her storyline is just horrendously sad. I actually feel numb just thinking about it. She freed herself from her tormentors. She fought for her life and ended the suffering she received at the hands of her family. But in the end, she never knew peace. And now, through no fault of her own, Angela is in eternal agony, living a life of unimaginable pain. Remember that first meeting between James and Angela in the graveyard, where she says "Mama" before correcting herself? Something about the way she does that is really disheartening. Like she never grew out of the mindset of a child because of her trauma. You can only have one childhood. The only time in your life when you're innocent and impressionable, needing to be taught how to navigate the world and survive, but still receiving protection and shelter from your parents. And Angela's was a miserable one. Her going up the stairs and James being unable to follow her signifies that no matter what other people do, there's no escaping the hell that's in your heart, especially if you've been abused at a young age. Whenever Angela speaks, it's really indicative of her past trauma. Frail, sad, unsure, and empty, always acting like a traumatized child. Even the way she says "don't order me around," showing how terrified she is that she isn't able to control anything. Sometimes I often forget she's just a fictional character. It just reminds me of the shatteringly sad truth that there's a lot of people like Angela in the real world. So many people whose suffering and despair is rooted in things that happened to them when they were an innocent child, leaving scars that deeply impact them in adulthood. It's so sad to think that there's so many people with stories like hers, and many of them weren't given happy endings. James and the player are at least able to agree on that. Deep down, all of us want to help Angela. We wish so deeply there was something we could do. But the real tragedy is that we can't. It's completely out of our hands. You and James have no control over what happens next. And a part of Angela recognizes this too. There's a part of her that does want to be healed, believing that someone can help her to get better. But she also recognizes the reality that she's too far gone. I think the part that really demonstrates that is when she asks this question.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
There's a struggle between these two tones of her mocking the absurdity of someone helping her, yet wishing there was another way. She did want help, and I'm pretty sure the feeling came to her at least once. I'm pretty sure that James crossing paths with Angela was more than just a coincidence. He ended up doing so much for her. He shows her a more positive view of men, and an example of a better life she could have had if she overcame her demons. She was shown that not all men have sinister desires and have good intentions for her, but she was too wrapped up in her insecurities to recognize them. It's very possible that Angela hated the feeling of being useless, needing someone else to help her. This is part of why she feels the need to mock James, because she was also mocking herself. There's also the fact when Angela talks about how James can save her, it's in first person. She's not just talking to James, she's also talking to you, the player, about how you can save her. This is someone that you can't rescue, and the game explicitly shuts you down for thinking about trying. You're not a hero, you're just another wandering soul of Silent Hill. This goes beyond breaking the fourth wall. This is reaching through it and driving a knife through your chest. We're mostly taught through the medium of gaming that any problem can be solved. But here, there's no solution. All the game allows us to do at this point is watch this poor woman disappear, engulfed in a fire of her own creation. It's a testament to people thinking it's easy to save someone, especially when someone is that broken. And it's even worse when they think they deserve the suffering. I'm sure there were a lot of people playing this game for the first time who thought there was a way to save Angela, like an alternate ending or a branching story path, just for Angela to throw it in your face every single time you get to this part of the game. What makes it even heavier is how quickly James is able to accept it. After Angela says, "That's what I thought," the next shot shows him hanging his head in shame. Not just because of the weight of Angela's words, but because he knows from experience he's not qualified to help her. If he couldn't help his wife, how would he be able to help her? He knows he can't do anything for her because both of them are broken. Then she asks him for the knife she gave him earlier, and James simply says no. Even after learning the truth and becoming a broken shell, he still has enough willpower to deny Angela's desire to hurt herself. Also, when Angela claims that she deserved what happened to her, James tells her how that's wrong. Even with his flaws and after all the ways that she insulted him, James still wanted Angela to know that she didn't deserve what happened to her. Many people have jumped to the conclusion he's a monster for killing his wife, but James continuing to offer Angela help at this point shows how much of an amazing complexity there is to him. But when she asks him if he's saving it for himself, he responds with, "I wouldn't kill myself." Of course, this foreshadows one of the possible endings the player can get, but notice the inflection in which he says it, putting extra focus on the myself part. This is his way of saying he wouldn't kill himself, but he recognizes his capacity to kill other people, pretty much like he did with Marionette. It's something that really adds to how broken James has become at this point. Another interesting detail is the fleshy portraits on the wall. They seem to resemble limbless torsos, but if you look at where their genitals should be, it looks like they were both castrated. So these portraits are meant to represent her hatred of her father and brother. A gross yet fascinating detail. The music during this scene is also deeply compelling. The piano and violin playing in the background represent the darkness and harshness of Angela and James' lives, with some gentle chimes representing the last shred of happiness they had, slowly fading away as they struggle with their demons. It just fills you with a profound sense of sorrow, that Angela's story just ends like this. A theme of tragedy, yet beautifully done. But the most soul-crushing part about this is when Angela tells James that for her, it's always like this, nothing but a world on fire. This is Angela's other world, the flame symbolizing the constant pain and agony she's in. There's no joy or happiness to be found, just death. And then you realize something by the way that Angela worded that sentence. She's not just talking about Silent Hill. Her entire life was like this, nothing but constant agony, and the sweltering heat from her innocence being burned. James might have had hope before he learned the truth, but Angela had no hope to begin with. She had no intention of getting out. It was all fire from the beginning. So why would it be any different in the end? Imagine living with that level of trauma your entire life. Of course you would want to die. And that's what Silent Hill gave her, a means to end her suffering. Angela without question is one of the most heart-wrenching concepts in a video game. Trapped in purgatory after a life of torture and abuse, thinking about everything that happened to her and how it comes to an end, it's all just deeply soul-crushing to watch. But aside from the tragedy, she's also a fantastic character. So many of her lines just send shivers across your body, forcing you to process the immense horror of her story. Everything she says and how she says it shows what happened to her and how it affected her perfectly. Her story allows you to experience how trauma affects people without showing the traumatizing event. A lot of people don't really understand the complexity of trauma, and things like this, when done well, can help people understand. Of all the human characters in the game, James has the most intrinsic chemistry with Angela. Two people in search of someone to ease their pain, and one of them comes to empathize with the other, trying to be their friend and help them in spite of their problems. They both suffer from thoughts of self-harm, blaming themselves for the horrible situation they're in. They both believe that they deserve what Silent Hill has done to them, either out of guilt or karma for their actions. Regardless of the ending you get, James and Angela are the most alike. In any other situation they could have been friends, but alas, it was just the hand of fate. And the way her story ends feels rather unique to her. She doesn't face her demons, nor does she embrace any sadistic tendencies. She simply succumbs to her depression. This could be the writer's way of neither condemning nor appraising her decision. She just is. And that's remarkable storytelling. Angela's story is both horrifying and overwhelmingly sad. And that's what makes good horror, by combining horror with sadness to create a captivating and poetic experience. And the saddest part of all is how helpless you feel during the last encounter. The flames make it impossible for James to reach Angela anymore, a way of saying that he can't do anything and has to accept it. And that acceptance is also something the player has to endure, no matter how badly they wish for Angela to have a happy ending. When you finally regain control of James, you can't progress up the stairs at all, and the only thing keeping you in the room is that silhouette of Angela still going up the stairs, forcing you to watch until her figure eventually disappears into the fire. This is the game directly telling you that you can't do anything to help her. No matter what you do, she'll always go up that burning staircase and disappear. No matter what choices the player makes, her story ends in Silent Hill. It teaches us a really important lesson. Sometimes in life there are people you just can't save, but it's not your fault. There was simply nothing you could have done, and all you can really do is try to come to grips with it. Silent Hill 2 is a truly groundbreaking game as it did something that's a rarity in its genre. Survival horror is almost always taken on a literal level, whether it's Resident Evil, Dead Space, The Evil Within, Fear, Clock Tower, Alone in the Dark, Alien Isolation, Dino Crisis, System Shock, or even the second half of Halo. All these franchises will just place you in the game's world with the developers saying, here's some monsters and some weapons, now try to survive. Silent Hill 2 didn't do that, placing you in a world where you can't survive by just fighting or running away. And the result is absolute perfection. Everything about this game just works, from the psychological plot, to the character writing, to the way the player has to piece everything together instead of just resolving everything with a gun. It didn't play around, it simply gave you the twisted truth. Angela was broken from the very beginning, and you can see it in her face and hear it in her words. The voice actor also does a fantastic job, properly flip-flopping her emotions and resonating the effects that Angela's trauma has on her. The story and psychology behind her behavior is so sad and poignantly true. And the simple fact is, it's not our job to save her. James wasn't called to the town to save Angela. He's there to come to terms with his sin. It's harsh and unforgiving yet satisfying at the same time. This is an example of what trauma does to a person. No matter where she runs to avoid the fire, it's always gonna follow her everywhere. It's really sad that Angela ends up suffering a fate worse than James, considering that she had far fewer reasons to feel guilty about what she did. But that's what makes this game's version of Silent Hill so fascinating. It's a self-manifested hell designed to punish those who deem themselves guilty. And that's much more terrifying because it's more real. Even if the town does want you to endure and face your inner demons and fears, only you can save yourself. And Angela just couldn't. And the worst part is that she went up those stairs believing she deserved what happened to her. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. Angela never deserved the hell her family put her through. That one scream says it all.
Daddy, please don't!
Making his way to the end, James finally reaches one last room, a hallway shaded in crimson blood red, with a low howling noise in the background. As you step forward, you see 9 red squares hanging on the wall. From the eerie music and there being 9 saves on the wall, this could be the game's way of warning you that this is your last chance to save. Brace yourself, because you're about to engage in the final battle. On its own, it's pretty creepy, but then there's the image of those 9 save papers forming that iconic square. Up to this point, these papers were just a way for you to occasionally save your progress. But after getting to this point, you begin to realize the secret meaning behind these save papers. The first time you interact with one of them, James says the following quote to himself: "Looking at this makes me feel like someone's scratching inside my skull." Why? Because they're actually symbolic of his memory of Mary slowly coming back to him. The more you find of these red squares, the closer James comes to remembering what he did. It could be that these safe papers are actually how he twisted Mary's letter in his head, fabricating the chance of her being alive. These red papers are actually the entirety of Mary's letter, blocked out of James' memory to keep him on his search. Deep down, he understands the significance of how it hurts him, which is why it grips against his skull whenever he looks at it, tying into how they save his progress. This is actually why he finds the first piece of the letter in front of a well. He's trying to drown it away, pushing it into the depths of his mind, which also coincides with how much of a role water plays in his version of Silent Hill. It's also why Mary's letter in James' inventory disappears over the course of the game, until it's nothing but a blank sheet of paper, and finally non-existent at all. The reason it's only a small portion of the real letter is because he twisted it with his calling for judgment, and as more of the game goes by, the delusion he created slips away. That's what Mary's letter seems to represent to James, a culmination of guilt, regret, and other emotions related to his trauma. The red could symbolize the blood on his hands, simultaneously covering the letter and revealing the truth about what he did. Not only that, but every time you go into a save screen you see James' face staring straight at the viewer, almost as if he was looking in a mirror. So maybe every time he's looking at one of these papers, he's also looking at himself through a lead-tinted filter of the letter, trying to show him the truth through the blood and not the words, which ties back to the set of 9 of these papers before the final battle. This is his subconscious trying to tell him something important. Look, this is what you did, and you have to face it now. It really shows just how much love and care that Team Silent put into this game. They utilized every element of this game to its fullest extent, even elements you wouldn't consider on multiple playthroughs. And so, James walks through the double doors, entering the next room and being greeted with another unsettling image. Maria hung upside down, about to be executed by not 1 but 2 pyramid heads. This is the moment that was foreshadowed in that portrait of the museum. But more interestingly, there's 2 pyramid heads and not just 1, because the number of pyramid heads represents the number of people James killed. The first one was Mary, the second was Eddie. James screams for the pyramid heads to leave them alone, but his pleas fall on deaf ears. Without hesitation, both pyramid heads drive their spears through Maria, killing her once again, leaving James in shock and silence. He slowly falls to his knees, hanging his head in shame. After a moment of silence, he comes to a new revelation. He was weak. That's why he needed Pyramid Head, someone to punish him for his sins. But that time is over. He knows the truth now, and it's time to end this. And here we have the second to last boss battle. This right here is one of my favorite scenes in all of video games, followed by one of my favorite boss fights of all time. Not necessarily because of how it plays, it's pretty much the same generic run from the monster and shoot it from a safe distance, but because of how it complements the story and James as a character. In this scene we learn the true nature of Pyramid Head, being another figure from James' mind. He was created out of his need to be punished for the sin of killing his wife, and that's exactly what he does throughout the game. From the moment we first saw him through those bars in the apartment building to this moment right here. Every time Pyramid Head kills Maria, it's to throw his sin in his face and force him to face the reality of what he did, to torment him until he accepts his sin. James now understands the true purpose behind Pyramid Head, realizing that all this time he was only punishing himself by refusing to accept what he did. So now the graveyard in the Labyrinth is becoming clear. All the people in Silent Hill who have a grave in the prison have links to death and murder. Angela killed her family, Eddie killed the dog, and James killed his wife. In the hospital, James cowardly slides into the elevator without looking back, and he has something of a delayed reaction when trying to save Maria. This could be one-on-one symbolism of what he did to Mary. He abandoned her egotistically, to get his life back as he said at the end. Then in the Labyrinth he finds Maria's body on the bed, resembling how he smothered her to death in the bedroom. Mary was making James confused and frustrated, but he made the decision to bury it inside. So later it was projected in the form of Pyramid Head. He represents James' slowly creeping heavy and unkillable guilt, burying himself deeper in his depression. But in order to progress further, James has to pull himself out of that hole. And in this fight he learns to accept his sin. His mind can no longer be tormented by grief and guilt, allowing him to finally stand against Pyramid Head. James knows what has to be done, and so, with the little faith he has left, gets ready to face it. Once he stops running from his past and faces up to it, Pyramid Head loses his significance. But in spite of this he doesn't resist, simply accepting James' challenge. One interesting detail is that just before the fight begins, the 2 Pyramid Heads take a step back, because they know this is no longer the same James they've been tormenting. They know that he's ready to fight and finally be free. He finally accepts his errors, and that gives him a new inner strength he never had before. He's no longer disconnected from the truth, so Pyramid Head no longer has any power over him. That's the remarkable thing about Pyramid Head. He wasn't created to kill James. He was meant to be a reminder of his sin. James was telling him that he was ready to take him on, leading Pyramid Head to face him on equal footing rather than a judge dominating him. This is where James achieves redemption, no longer the past version of himself, harrowing a journey to overcome himself and survive. What this boss fight symbolizes is James fighting off his anger, frustration, and other feelings that led to him killing Mary. Pyramid Head was those feelings incarnated into a monster. And even though James isn't an action hero, it's really profound and epic to see him standing and accept the truth, turning towards his tormentors to face them. For the first time since the start of the game, he breaks his monotone and faces his fears after he stops caring about being afraid. This is where it all falls apart, and James is finally ready to tear it all down. Maria, Pyramid Head, and his own denial. This is what Silent Hill was teaching James from the beginning. How to treat his trauma. You gotta go through all the depths in hell, see the trauma itself, recognize what happened, how you felt, what you did, and atone for your sins. Only then will you be free. In that sense, Pyramid Head was actually a good guy all along. Maria's the one trying to keep James from accepting his sin, and Pyramid Head is killing her so he can move on. He's a manifestation of a broken man punishing himself, yet helping him through his guilt by making him face the truth. That's why he never killed James when he was given a chance, because killing him wasn't what he was made for. Pyramid Head takes the form of James' guilt, but he uses it to help him face reality. Him killing those monsters during the first encounter was an example of making James face how he sees himself, and when that doesn't work, he tries confronting him directly with his sword. And when he sees James with Maria trying to manipulate him, he finds his true target. Notice how during the chase in the hospital he goes after Maria and not James, killing her to force James out of his blindness. The first step is making him admit what he did, then let him solve it on his own. So when everything is executed right and James learns the truth, the Pyramid Heads confront him at his strongest point, and by fighting him, they give him the confidence to face the monstrous Maria that waits beyond them. Pyramid Head is an allegory for James' remorse. The helmet he wears symbolizes the terrible weight that James has on his shoulders, and the sword he carries around is an allegory for his pain. He actually wanted what was best for James. In spite of him being depicted as a villain, he's actually an ally. He does bad things, but for a greater final good. In a way, he's actually a tragic character, because in spite of his nature and true intentions, he's destined to die and be forgotten at the end of his job. They clearly know that he's come to terms, so with the best of their abilities, the two test him one last time. And these elements of his character are also incorporated in the boss fight. Notice how they approach James slowly, giving him a chance to fight back. The battle isn't meant to be scary, it's meant to be the climax of James' character arc, taking place after he overcame his fears and accepted the truth. Even though this isn't the true climax of the story, it really feels like it. All the themes of Silent Hill 2 come to a head in this scene. Sadness, hopelessness, perversions, brokenness, but all layered in a faint surreal ray of hope, as if all these things are just part of being human. And there's a very real beauty in that. This scene is the culmination of a series of emotionally strong moments, building up to James remembering himself and learning what it takes to change. Now he's fighting the hardest he's ever had, with everything in his arsenal to stay alive. And the longer he fights, the more he accepts what he did and faces his demons head on. And that's when the Pyramid Heads realize that they're no longer needed, and James finally has no desire for punishment. And so, they get rid of themselves. That's the most interesting element of the fight. James never really kills them. He just holds them off long enough until they feel they fulfilled their purpose. They accomplish the task they were created for, forcing James to come to terms with his guilt and stop running. You can't kill guilt. You can only let it go. This is what happens when one finally realizes that Silent Hill manifests your own inner demons into a terrifying reality, and the only way to defeat them is to make peace with them. And that's what James does, finally facing himself to be free to leave Silent Hill. One more thing to talk about is how beautifully done the music of this boss fight was composed. This theme portrays a man confronting his deepest, darkest, and most sinister truth about himself. He can run away from it, fight it, bury it in a hole forever, but no matter what he does, it'll always remain. The wounds caused by it may heal, but it will come back and remain forever as scars. The clanging metal, scraping steel, and industrial sounds mixed with a choir in a church is an ingenious selection of sounds for what happens in this battle. It comes across as somber yet intense, an auditory manifestation of everything James went through. After all this time, he finally came to terms with his crime, and now he was ready to put it to rest. In spite of the music sounding dark and hopeless, it actually signifies triumph and victory over oneself, getting rid of what's keeping you down in life, rising above your inner demons and coming out on top. You can't undo what's already been done. No matter what you do, your sins will never go away. But you can still survive. It won't be easy, but it'll never be impossible. It sounds like redemption and reckoning, vengeance and acceptance, with a heavenly choir motivating you to fight on. James saying now it's time to end this further adds to what the music represents. It embodies the emotions of a person who's ready to face their judgment and get back on their feet to fight their way back into the light. The dissonant part of the theme makes sense for the punishment, and the harmonic choir for the catharsis that happens. It doesn't give you the feeling of an action-packed battle, but pure sadness and atonement. James just wanted everything to end. He didn't care what was going to happen after. He wanted to be free from his sins once and for all. It instills a feeling of finality in how the game is coming to an end, and it also signifies one's life suffering coming to a realization, the will to carry on. clawing out of the rubble of this forsaken fate and escaping from Hell's maw. It can even be seen as a sign of relief. At this point in the game, James has descended into the deepest, darkest level of his own twisted psyche, but now he knows the truth, and all the madness can be put to rest at last. It represents the breakthrough in his therapy. James no longer seeks punishment, now he seeks redemption. And with Pyramid Head behind him, James has one more obstacle to confront: Maria. He goes through the doors leading to the next hallway, a path that will eventually lead him to the roof of the hotel. But before he can get there, one final lingering memory plays in his mind, the memory of his last conversation with Mary.
Mary?
What do you want, James?
I brought you some flowers.
Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go home already.
Mary, what are you saying?
Look, I'm disgusting. I don't deserve flowers. Between the disease and the drugs, I look like a monster. Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already! I'm no use to anyone. I'll be dead soon anyway. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. It'd be easier if they'd just kill me. But I guess the hospital is making a nice profit off me. They want to keep me alive. Are you still here? I told you to go! Are you deaf? Don't come back! James! Wait! Please don't go! Stay with me! Don't leave me alone! I didn't mean what I said! Please, James! Tell me I'll be okay! Tell me I'm not going to die! Help me!
And so, we finally have full context for what led to Silent Hill 2. During her time in the hospital, Mary couldn't come to terms with her impending death. This resulted in her growing cold and verbally abusive to people, friends, family, even her husband, and mostly her husband. She drove him away, made him feel like garbage for helping her, and made him feel trapped and isolated in a situation that was out of his control. And at the same time, Mary was scared of dying and being alone. After pushing James away, she calls him in an attempt to apologize. She breaks down in tears, begging for James to help her, to reassure her that she's not gonna die. This was most likely the final interaction between them before James killed her, and now Silent Hill is throwing that in his face. And with this in mind, it brings back an important question into discussion. What was the true intent behind James' actions? What was he really motivated by? Did he really do it to end her suffering? Could he not bear the sight of her rotting away? Did he do it because he resented her? Was it because he hated her for treating him badly? Was it because of the stress of the situation? Was he overwhelmed by the hospital bills? Did Mary become a burden to him? Or was it a combination of all three? In the Leave-In in Water ending, there's a brief conversation between James and Mary, to which James admits to hating her for taking his life away, but also that he didn't want to see her suffer, recalling how Mary wanted the pain to end. It's likely that the latter was just an excuse he was using to rationalize his actions, which is why he's quick to admitting to the former. But depending on the ending you get, Mary asks him an important question. If that's true, why do you look so sad? Mary knew his heart better than he knew himself, and I think it's clear that James' guilt and conscience was pushing aside the reality that it wasn't just for him. He didn't want her to suffer, because why would you want a person you love to suffer? And she knew that, but even so, you can tell that what James did was wrong and immoral because of how the story views his actions. He thought he was throwing his life away by taking care of a sick person. James really did love Mary, but his moment of selfishness was far greater than his love. If he really killed for love, he wouldn't have been brought to Silent Hill in the first place, because he wouldn't be suffering from guilt. It's also why he was so heartbroken after learning the truth. He had a psychotic episode that led to a moment of weakness. A moment of weakness he instantly regretted. But the real point is that James had to accept what actually happened. He let go of reality and drove himself into delusions, which allowed him to believe Mary was alive, even though she had died 3 years ago. When in reality, Mary was dead for maybe a day, and she was already in the backseat of his car at the start of the game. He spent the entire time in Silent Hill, battling monsters, seeing people mentally crumble, just to find out the person he was looking for was right back where he started. In the hallway, the part where she says it'd be easier if they just killed her sounds very clear to James. It's like he remembers that part of the conversation better because it gives him an excuse for what he did. It could be argued that a part of it was an act of mercy, but the fact remains that he killed her without her consent, and it wasn't entirely out of love. He killed her out of frustration. He felt like his life was wasted taking care of someone who was abusing him, so it could have been a combination of both. It was those feelings of love and hate that conflicted with each other until they turned into madness, whereas mine is trying to rationalize but at the same time demonize what he did. And the thing about that is, it's not unbelievable that something like this could happen. You can love and hate someone at the same time. In the same way, you can be happy and sad at the same time. James was torn between loving and resenting his dying wife. The novelization does go into detail about how James was a really good husband. He was actually really devoted to Mary, but something during the time of her illness caused a shift in those feelings. As a result, he ended up isolating himself, sinking into depression and alcoholism, which was foreshadowed in the Heavens nightclub. He was no longer happy with his marriage, dealing with a version of his wife that was nothing but a decaying shell of her former self. It got to the point he could no longer take it and took matters into his own hands, and the guilt of what came after drove him to Silent Hill. The idea that she was alive, no matter how small, meant that he could rectify some of the things he did and ask forgiveness. He was in denial not because he doesn't want to say she was dead, but due to regret of the things he did. The whole game was him avoiding what he did and not taking responsibility. He didn't go there for her. He went there for himself. That in turn makes his act of killing Mary selfish, and an act of betrayal towards their marriage. What makes it even sadder is that when he did it, Mary didn't have any time to understand why. She wasn't thinking, maybe he's doing this to end my suffering, or maybe the stress of taking care of me and paying the hospital bills was so overwhelming he just snapped. All she had time to think was, oh my god, why is he doing this to me? Mary died confused and betrayed, and those emotions ended up carrying over to Maria. With all these things in mind, it's pretty easy to believe that James is a horrible person who deserved to die for what he did, and I can't understand why people would come to that conclusion based on what was shown. But then I remembered the secret scene in the hotel, where James puts on the headphones and remembers his argument with Mary's doctor.
Mary's going to die? You must be joking. I'm very sorry. But you're a doctor. It's your job to heal people. How can you just let her die? Please, calm down. As her doctor, I promise I'll do what I can. But there's still no effective treatment for her condition.
How long does she have?
I'm afraid I'm not sure. 3 years at most. Perhaps 6 months. It's impossible to say with certainty.
As I said before, a lot of people don't even know about this scene because of how well hidden it is. Yet it adds so much context and complexity to the situation. James is acting extremely desperate, trying to get the doctor to work harder and denying the inevitability of Mary dying. And with how overwhelming the situation was, his mind just snapped. If James really didn't love or care about Mary, this scene wouldn't be in the game. Keep in mind that this is where James' psychosis got the idea that Mary died 3 years ago, so her death had to occur around the time of this argument. In spite of being an optional scene, it ends up opening a giant new perspective on the situation. Although it's not shown, it is heavily implied that James did visit Mary multiple times, and spent a lot of time as her caretaker while visiting. I would imagine that months and months of constant neglect and chastising on Mary's part pushed an already distraught James over the brink. And even Mary acknowledges this herself, apologizing multiple times. So we have James pouring the majority of his time into tending to his wife, constantly seeing her sick and upset, while also working his full-time job, and on top of that, put most of their money into the hospital bills. Obviously, James didn't handle the situation maturely. He could have been more patient as she was suffering more than him. However, it was such a complex and stressful situation with various factors that were completely out of James' control. The frustration builds up because not only do you have to take care of a terminally ill person, but you also have to put up with them lashing out at you. Even if they don't mean it, it eventually starts to get to you. Anyone who says, oh come on, it wasn't a big deal, James was just a crybaby, clearly don't know what they're talking about because they never experienced a situation like this before. The disease, Mary's suffering, her abuse, and James' normal life being taken away were all contributing factors that led to his actions. James killing Mary was a result of multiple factors: wanting to end her suffering, resenting her for her abuse, and being overwhelmed by the disease itself. Even if James resented her, he still loved her as evidenced by everything else we've seen. He went through the the effort of going to a town filled with monsters not caring for his well-being to see her again. Unlike Eddie, who just ran away and enjoyed being a killer. A psychopath would have just hidden the body and go on casually with their life. But the guilt James felt was genuine and raw, hating himself for what happened and feeling remorse. This is why he was actually shocked when he found out he killed her, because he always thought she died long ago from her illness. The fact that he experiences such crushing guilt afterwards is proof of his love for Mary. And that's what drew him to Silent Hill. Not just the sins themselves, but his guilt and yearning to be punished for them. He even says that this was Pyramid Head's sole purpose. Now, this isn't an argument for whether or not James is innocent. Obviously, he's not. But he's also not evil and irredeemable. James is portrayed as a lost soul, hopelessly in love with his wife and in mourning. We know he suffered immensely when she got sick and was quite depressed, but as we learn more about him, we get to see his apathy, his bizarre behavior towards things, and we learn later that he didn't just kill her because she was suffering, but also for his own selfish and petty reasons. He was angry at her for taking away his life, and he had an underlying sinisterness towards her. James was trapped in this cycle of abuse and depression when he just wanted to live life. Obviously he loved her, but he was also selfish. And like all the lies, if you tell yourself the same thing over and over, you can delude yourself into believing it's true. That's what he did, just saying she died 3 years ago, over and over and over to himself. But in the end, he still regretted what he did, coming to Silent Hill to try and make things right. It's not an excuse, but an explanation of a flawed character. In the same way Mary's treatment of James had an explanation but was still inexcusable. Some people can handle pain and stress more than others, but empathy at the cost of one's well-being can take a toll and change you. This is why you can't simply bring yourself to hate James or judge him so easily, at least once you have the full context of everything that happened, because the situation he was placed in was too complex to be put in black and white. It's heavier to think about and more complicated to understand than Eddie's bloodlust or Angela's suffering. Imagine being so distraught and grief-stricken that you hallucinate that your recently murdered terminally ill wife is still alive, and she wrote a letter telling you she's waiting for you. Then you end up in a psychological breakdown in a purgatory manifested around you, filled with monsters and other tormented people. This breakdown drives you to the very core of your own inner hell, forcing you to face the deepest, scariest, and most repressed shit in your soul. James was a bad man when he killed Mary, but he's nowhere near as vile and cruel as you'd expect. It's not like he was maliciously lying to everyone he meets. He believed his own lies after the psychotic breakdown. While many players turned on James after believing him to be a sincere man, I just felt so saddened throughout the game every time I saw or read something about Mary. James wasn't a hateful monster, but a sad wreck wasting away in limbo. Obviously what he did was a crime with a toll to pay to his own soul and the law, but by the way he assumes the horrible truth, and the irrational way he kept searching for her, James really cared about Mary and wished things happened differently. It feels as if a lot of his guilt isn't caused by the actual killing. It was caused in large part by the way he treated her while she was dying. He feels guilty because Mary was aggressive and difficult, but she was also scared of dying. And it wasn't her fault they were in this predicament. The killing was just the last straw. What James did was wrong. He obviously had no excuse, but the situation was very complicated. Mary herself was stressed out about her condition, which caused her to lash out, and James still wanted to do everything he could for her, at least when she was first diagnosed. Mary was right to be upset about her predicament, but she was also pouring negative energy into the situation. Silent Hill 2 does a fantastic job confronting the reality of how someone you love can be a burden, completely by no choice of their own. When someone becomes sick and dying, the reality is they can become a burden, but that doesn't mean you don't love them. It was all a mixture of different emotions: resentment, sympathy, love, guilt, and abandonment. He wanted to put an end to both of their suffering. Mary hated dying slowly because she knew she was becoming a burden, and James hated her being a burden to him because he hated watching her slowly dying and not being able to do anything about it. What I love about James is that he's not the normal stereotypical hero protagonist of the game. He's just a sad man trying to find the person he loved most and can't let go. Even outside his relationship with Mary, his personality is deeper than that through the good deeds he does throughout the game. All the times he helped Angela, offered Eddie guidance, even being friends with Laura in spite of her treating him badly. I actually can't think of a single instance in which he acts selfishly outside of his wife's death. His character is full of layers, and you dig deeper into what those layers are, exploring his mind and personality as you progress through the game. James is neither a hero or a villain, but a sad man who was pushed to his limits. Caring for a dying person is extremely painful. It's a horrible situation completely out of your control, and you can't do anything except wait for it to be over. It's just really depressing to think about. But at the same time, he still loved Mary and wish he could have done more. James may not be a good person, but he's not a bad person either. There's a reason Mary forgives him in the leave-in water endings, because she recognizes how he came to terms with his wrongdoings and wanted to do right by her. In that sense, James does redeem himself in the good endings. He confronts his sins, the reality of what he's done, showed that he truly loved and cared about Mary, and went through the depths of his own hell to make it right. His redemption is the purpose of the story. Whether or not he forgives himself is up to the player. And that's just James' side of the situation. Mary's side is just as heartbreaking, if not more so. The way she feels insecure about herself because of her disease, coupled with the constant pain she was in, was unbearable for her. Mary was just no longer herself. She was just a shell of anger and frustration, and she projected that onto James. He was already mentally unstable knowing his wife was deathly ill, but when his wife turned into a spiteful person, it's just heartbreaking. Mary said she wanted to die, but at other times she didn't. It's clear that while Mary was struggling with her fate, James was struggling with his loneliness, and all the time she spent verbally abusing him just made it worse. I understand why people in this situation would lash out like that, but it's also frustrating for the one who has to take care of you, because not only do they have to put up with the fact you're going to die, but they also get treated horribly while doing a really stressful job. When you actually finish the game and get to this scene, you see that Mary wasn't as innocent as some were led to believe. She was constantly going back and forth between someone who drove James mad and someone who felt sorry about how much she was hurting him. This is why Maria was acting so bipolar during that anyway scene. It was meant to foreshadow Mary's mood swings while she was sick. You can be verbally abusive while not intending to be. James spends the entire game being belittled by Maria, and while it could be a reflection of his psychological need to be punished, it also may be a reflection of his final years with Mary. It's really understandable that Mary would be so bitter and unhappy. Being deathly ill and tied to a hospital bed for a miserable last few years, it can cause someone to lash out, hurting the people around them. If this waterfall of negative emotion is a snapshot of how their relationship was deteriorating over the last couple years, then it really makes the situation less black and white than just assuming James was unloving and selfish. They both genuinely loved each other, but they're also both responsible for allowing their hatred to boil over. There was nothing for them to hold on to except the inevitable pain and misery once it was time for Mary to pass on. And they were so angry about it and didn't want to accept it. The way their relationship deteriorated because of this situation might be one of the most poignantly tragic things I've ever seen in a video game. They were happy together, they loved each other very much, and then something out of their control not only tore them away from each other, but caused them to slowly dismantle the love they had and grow to resent one another. Something that both of them were painfully aware of and regretted, but can never take it back. And that's another thing that was so depressing. This situation was out of their control, brought upon by a force of nature. Mary wasn't killed or seriously injured in an accident or a mugging or a fight or anything like that. She just got sick, and there was no effective cure or treatment for her condition. Having something like this happen to her when she was still so young and brimming with life, when she still had so much to live for, when there were so many things in life she never got to do, it tore Mary apart to her core. It's just not fair. And there's no deeper explanation for why it happened. It was just because. It just didn't make sense to her, and trying to make sense of it made her sad, angry, depressed, and scared. This swirl of emotion left her confused, causing her to have her own psychotic episodes. And what makes it so scary is that it's a normal reaction to have. She was terrified of dying and it wasn't even her fault. She even admittedly apologizes to James after lashing out. The sorrow in her tone as she tries to apologize and call for James to stay with her is so haunting and lingering, like it's a real situation and not just a story in a video game. The human emotion of pushing someone away but really wanting them to stay with you during your hardest times, the sheer power of regret that unfolds here, and at her worst times begging for love and forgiveness. The hardest part is knowing she wasn't even antagonistic on purpose. She was simply terrified. Listening to the verbal abuse of Mary turning into desperation for James to not leave her is really difficult to listen to. You can see that both of these characters are at their weakest point. James developed resentment towards the woman he loved to the point that he was driven to despise her, and Mary being sick and not being able to accept her death made her take her anger out on James. But in the end, she starts breaking down because she doesn't want to die, especially when she wanted to spend more time with a husband who loved her. This scene is so realistic to the point that the ugly deformed monsters, the petrifying atmosphere of Silent Hill, and Eddie's sadistic rampage are nothing compared to this, because it's a tragic situation that's so relatable and possible that it could happen to anyone, and thinking about it makes you feel scared for the future. This is how Silent Hill 2 is actually scary, not with monsters, dark abandoned buildings, blinding fog, or even even eerie music, but how it portrays the very real horrors in our day-to-day lives, to the point that it makes you scared of what might happen if you were in a situation like this. It makes you question how you would react in this situation. What would you do if you were James? Would you prolong their suffering? Would you put them out of their misery? Would you have the stomach for it? Would you be able to handle the guilt and regret that comes after? What would motivate you to do what you do? What would you be driven by? What would be going on in your head as this is happening? It's something universal to the human experience, and the inevitability of it makes you nauseous and it twists your stomach as you think about it. I can actually picture this scene happening in my head, just listening to the echoes of their words. James feeling helpless and looking at her face the whole time, feeling frustrated trying to comfort her knowing he can't help, but also not being able to tolerate her verbal abuse anymore. That moment of pause in the middle of Mary's rant speaks volumes. At this point, he's just thinking about what to do to end her suffering. The doctors failed him, his relationship was fading, and he was forced to be alone. It's an incredibly tragic story, and you can't help but feel sorry for both of them. And it could also have a tragic twist to it from a gameplay perspective. Imagine you're playing this game for the first time, walking down the hallway while listening to Mary berate James. You reach the door, then Mary says, "Don't come back," and a moment of silence follows. You wouldn't be wrong to assume that was the end of the memory, that Mary doesn't say anything after that. So you simply do the natural thing and open the door to the final area. Only by holding off that urge to press the action button for a bit longer do you hear the rest of Mary's final conversation with James. Mary breaking down in tears, overwhelmed with guilt and regret, how it escalates into fear of her inevitable death, the terror of being left to die alone, horrified that it's her fault for pushing James away, wanting her husband to stay by her side to make the pain easier to bear. Listening to this just gives you a feeling of emptiness, to hear what was most likely their final conversation before James killed Mary. But what makes it even worse is that this is just how the player sees it. Imagine in universe that James made the mistake of pressing the action button, leaving the room before hearing the part where she breaks down. He walks away believing she hated him, never knowing how she truly felt. It still hurts me that she never had any ill will against James. All of that was in James' own head because he believed she hated him, and that precise detail is reflected in the length of the hallway. It's just short enough that you could easily leave without hearing the whole conversation, simulating how James didn't hear the end of it. All he knows is that Mary yelled at him to get out, and he never came back. This is his first time hearing the second half of her final words, years too late. All because he didn't take that moment to pause long enough before pressing the action button. That is an ingenious detail. Team Silent made absolutely sure that the hallway would be long enough to coincide with the dialogue, and holding on to that silence as the player reaches the door, then inserting Mary's pleas for James to come back, right when the player could have pressed the action button and opened the door at any time, cutting off her desperate cries like James did. The player is capable of making the same mistake James did, never knowing how Mary truly felt. This is, without any hint of sarcasm, the most brilliant and stunning creative decision I've ever seen in a video game, truly making the player feel sucked into the world of the game rather than just controlling it. And it's levitated even further by the masterful voice acting of Monica Taylor Horgan. She put her soul into every single line. She did her damnedest to make this dialogue convincing, and she just nailed it. It's an incredible contrast to the rest of the vocal performances in the game that were meant to be awkward, to simulate the dreamlike state of Silent Hill. Compared to every other character, Mary sounds so insanely lifelike. And it makes sense in universe because this is a memory from before Silent Hill. This is exactly why I believe James' feelings for Mary to be true, because her feelings for him were true. It captures how love and death are nuanced and hard to deal with, perfectly demonstrating the dilemma so you can sympathize with both James and Mary's side of the situation. It even seeps into their conversation after the final battle. It genuinely feels like Mary's trying to get it through to James that just because he did it for a selfish reason, it doesn't mean it was the only reason. If James really just wanted her out of the way, he wouldn't have felt this guilt, and he wouldn't have suffered after her death. That's why I think it was both, and why it makes for the most emotionally impactful conclusion I've ever witnessed in a video game. The people behind this game cared so deeply about the story they were conveying, and made it part of your essence as you unraveled more of the events. It makes it feel like Silent Hill 2 is in a video game. It feels like real people going through real dilemmas, fully immersing you into the tragedy that befell them. They both had their reasons to hold on, but their reasons for letting go were far stronger. They had a really genuine bond, but it was decaying. You can tell that they really loved each other, even with all the problems they were dealing with. Witnessing what happened and the entire context behind it just broke me. You can understand why it happened, no matter how painful it is. James tells Mary that he hated her and wanted his life back, but Mary recognizes how sad he is when he confesses this, almost as if it wasn't really true. This couple deeply cared about each other. The circumstances surrounding the illness just blinded them to it. It was only after Mary's suffering ended that the truth became clear again to both of them. After learning about the whole story, I do think that James deserves forgiveness. Even though he did do something wrong, he went through hell to make it right. A part of me actually thinks James never really hated Mary. He was scared. She was scared. Mary was suffering horribly, and watching her suffer made James suffer. He knew that she was no longer the same as she was before and that the illness was killing her mind in the same way it was killing her body. He believed the only option left was to release her. She was caught between not wanting to hurt anymore and being afraid of death, but he never knew how much she was holding inside. Even James himself has a moment of hesitation when she challenges that notion. She really just wanted him to move on and be happy. Even in her final letter, she apologizes for her abuse, and she tells James that she'll always be grateful to him for all the wonderful years they shared together. It's like this part of the game was scientifically designed to stab you right in that precise spot of your heart. It's not always easy to make sense of what people who love each other do, but in the end, James knew he had to endure Silent Hill to become the person he was before Mary got sick. One final crucible to show him and her that he truly loved her and wanted her pain to end. I honestly don't think I'll ever have the correct set of words to properly describe and explain how I felt watching this game's final moments, both the leave route and the in-water route. But not the Maria route, because that ending makes James look like a monstrous sociopath who willingly replaced his actual wife with a figment of his imagination that only appealed to his basic desires. This ending makes James look like a truly irredeemable and worthless waste of human life who learned nothing from his time in Silent Hill. Seriously, fuck the Maria ending. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, because there's still one loose end to tie up before we reach the end of this incredible journey. James makes his way to the hotel rooftop, where Maria's waiting for him. This time she's completely taken on Mary's form, a final desperate act to get him to stay with her. But James is no longer falling for her tricks, and is done with her. Unable to accept James' final decision, this is the last straw for her. If she can't have James to herself, then she decides they'll both die together. She finally reveals her true nature to James, her form fully twisted into a monster. But James knows there's no turning back now, and he's finally ready to bury his ghost. And yet even now, I still can't help but feel fascinated by Maria as a character. The final understanding of Silent Hill 2 is that Maria's the antagonist, not Pyramid Head. Everything she does is to reel James in a hurt and emasculate him. No matter how hard she tries to be a real person, she's not. Everybody else had a reason to be in Silent Hill, but Maria was just a monster. And she's also a deeply manipulative individual. The way Maria just screws with him the entire game, gaslighting him, emasculating him, even making him question his love for Mary and bashing him for still loving her even though she's dead, is really devious. In that regard, she's even scarier than Pyramid Head. The way she tries to convince him that she'll never yell at him or make him feel bad is really pathetic, especially with the knowledge that she already did this to him so many times throughout the game. Maria's personality is incredibly malevolent, representing James' unwillingness to let go. Maria doesn't want James to trust her. She wants him to let go of Mary and embrace the illusion by being the most attractive version of his wife. The problem is that James is never content with her no matter what she does. At first sight, Maria may seem like the seductive, loving version of his wife, but in reality, Maria's the version of Mary that James didn't want, the one that was always verbally abusive to him. She's nothing but a creation of Silent Hill made to torment and punish him. Even though she does have some of Mary's personality traits and memories, she's only an entity driven by her purpose to punish James. It also seems to be linked to her many resurrections. Whenever she's brought back from death, she brings a piece of Mary with her, and the line between the two becomes more and more blurred, until she finally becomes an exact double of Mary at the end. Her entire purpose is to be both a punishment and a truth that James has to face, which honestly makes her a really sad character. Maria was a normal person, or at least she thought she was, but she turned out to be a puppet created for James. And in the end, James rejected her. He rejected her reason for living. She never had any free will and was forced into a game of deception, a tool to be thrown away. She's a monster and a villain, but she didn't want to be one. She was just born from a wish. She just woke up in heaven's night, stuck between trying to survive and wanting to end it all herself, eventually trying to bring peace to a grieving father and find purpose for herself, even if she is not real, and that purpose was stolen from her. Even though she was only forged by the town as a part of James' psyche, she's still technically a person. She had Mary's bad memories, but also her good memories. In the same way James had an idealized version of Mary through Maria, Maria had an idealized image of James, the caring husband that's supposed to protect her. But James can't do that for her. She was created solely to remind him of his greatest sin, Her dying 3 times and yet coming back like nothing happened proved that she was nothing but an entity. Whenever she meets James, she's constantly trying to prove herself to be real, only to fail every time. James killing Maria is meant to be representative of his guilt, ridding himself of his nostalgic manifestation of his wife. This is James fully accepting the truth. Not that he killed Mary, but that Mary is dead and she can never come back. And he has to prepare himself to live with that fact. It's honestly heartbreaking to see what ends up happening to Maria after everything she did to feel alive. She's so desperate to be loved, to not be lonely anymore. But James doesn't even see her as a person. He went to that roof with the intention of killing her. Notice how angry and aggressive she is in the leave-in in water endings, how her desperate tone turns into cruelty. She knows that no matter what she does, even if she succeeds in killing James, she'll never truly live. She's simply an abandoned tool now that James has moved on, doomed to fade and fade alone. What follows next is the ending, in which James receives his fate based on how the player perceives him as a character. But one thing remains consistent in every ending. We see the full letter Mary wrote for him. Without giving anything away, this is the single most gut-wrenching ending to ever be placed in a video game. Every swirling emotion that I went over earlier is perfectly emulated in this letter, and it acts as the final send-off for Mary and her relationship with James, wanting him to move on and start a new life for himself, and to no longer cling to his guilt. Even better, the voice actress playing Mary genuinely found the script so moving that she actually cried. She actually broke down when reading her letter to James. This is what good voice acting sounds like, because she wasn't acting. In that moment in time, she became Mary Sunderland, transcending into the identity of the character herself. And it makes for a perfect ending to an already perfect video game experience. Silent Hill 2 is pretty much the nail that sticks out the most in the original trilogy, and that's actually a good thing. Silent Hill 1 and 3 are horror games through and through, because the villains are extrinsic rather than intrinsic. They follow the story of a man and his adopted daughter getting tangled in the web of a sinister cult trying to resurrect ancient demons to destroy humanity. Silent Hill 2 isn't about that, taking place in the same universe but having its own unique plot. It's a very tragic story, showing us how someone can slowly be consumed by depression and trauma. It does more than just scare us. It communicates with us in a way that we can go, wow, such a great video game that messes with our feelings. As I said before, it's a more human type of horror, but done in a way that's so beautiful and spiritual to the human soul. On one side you have Angela, who was completely in the right to kill her family, but still being consumed by guilt and trauma to the point she thought she deserved it. And on the other side you have Eddie, where yes, he was bullied, but not in the same situation where he had no other options. And finally there's James, who toes a very similar line both in his guilt and the actions that led up to it. It's true that he killed his wife, but his wife had a terrible illness that disfigured her and made her feel like she wasn't even a person anymore. So James takes on a gray area where he's given a second chance to acknowledge his wrongdoings. Silent Hill calls people that need to be punished for their sins and accept what happened, and James is the only one who's able to accomplish that. It's also really interesting the way the game shows how everyone experiences the town differently. We already went over Eddie's, Angela's, and Laura's versions, but we still have to go over James' version. For him, many of the buildings are waterlogged, like they've been flooded and drowned. This is meant to represent his guilt and self-loathing, like he's drowning himself in his sorrow. The only building that doesn't appear to be affected by water is the hospital. It's constantly decaying, not just with rust, but something organic and fetid. It symbolizes the sickness that ate away at Mary, haunting James without him realizing it. It also represents how each of the characters handle trauma in different ways. Eddie's lashing out, Angela's self-destruction, and Laura's survival, all three of which represent a possible path James can take. In this regard, Eddie and Angela are very important characters as they demonstrate how their situations bleed into James. Angela is a tragic character forced into a horrific situation. She simply couldn't live that hell anymore, but she still feels remorse for what she did. Then you have Eddie, who represents apathy and rage. He acts really unhinged, leaving you question what his true motives are until the end, similarly to how James did. They're also really dark reflections of abuse victims, showing how the mind distorts when you're constantly being pushed to a point where enough is enough. Angela follows the path of a victim that blames themselves, to the point she believes she has to die to make amends for killing someone. Her demons weren't even her fault, but in the end her trauma won against her. Eddie is the opposite of this, who relishes in what he did, bending under all of it and finding joy in killing people. Killing is not supposed to be fun or something you receive pleasure from. Killing is supposed to be a means to an end, but Eddie treats it like a game, something that gives him a sick sadistic high. For that he became a villain in his own right, Many people have criticized the voice acting for being cheesy and uncanny, but it benefits the atmosphere the game's going for. The awkward voice work added to the eerie, dreamlike quality of the cutscenes, a serendipitous step that added to the brilliance of the game. It's meant to show how these characters are socially awkward as a result of their mental issues, making their behaviors more suspicious. I think James is my favorite example of this because it makes the big twist more unpredictable and impactful. With the way he talks, interacts with people, and comes across as oblivious to their feelings, you would never suspect he would do anything to harm his wife. The whole game captures this feeling of a nightmare that you can't understand or imagine, which is why it's so interesting to think about how everyone experiences the town differently. It helps make the atmosphere of the game more mysterious and paranormal, and it never uses any horrible jump scares to get a cheap reaction from you. Every scary element of this game is authentic because it allows you to stay immersed in the world. It's also what makes the story so engaging, because Team Silent draws you into the environment using very specific techniques. Everything in this game is given proper pacing and build-up so you get a better sense of anticipation. Every location in the game is structured differently, giving them a unique layout, and the amount of detail placed into these environments is astonishing. Remember, this game was developed for a 2001 release, meaning that the PS2 was a hardware that developers were still tinkering with. The maximum potential of the PS2 was unclear, yet Silent Hill 2 goes above and beyond to make every single bit of space feel real. The bowling alley, the prison, the forest trail, every individual room in the apartments and hospital. Every area in this game is crafted with so much focus and art direction that it's almost impossible to think this was a game from 2001. The soundtrack is amazing, one of the greatest compositions of music I've listened to. It amazingly reflects the mood of the atmosphere and what's going on in the story. It's also very unique as a survival horror soundtrack because it's not just filled with loud booming instruments. A large portion of the music is gentle and therapeutic, beautiful melodies that relax you instead of tensing you up. I wouldn't even describe the soundtrack as scary, I would describe it as gloomy and sad, with so many pieces focusing on illuminating the story rather than intimidating the player. The characters are very distinct and relatable, with every single member of the cast being both fantastically written and serving a practical purpose in the plot. They're not heroes facing villains, they're facing themselves. They face their broken minds and are basically the antagonists but to themselves. The horror comes from relating to how these characters feel, and relating to how they were driven to do horrible things. For me, that's the scariest part. Regardless of the horrible things they've done, it's something you can relate to. But the most important thing about Silent Hill 2 is the journey of James and the message it teaches people. The story of a seemingly strong man trying to find his wife, and in the end you slowly see him unravel and you can only hope he doesn't lose the fight to himself. James Sunderland is one of the most broken characters in all of gaming, but at the same time, he can fix himself. Even if he can't make the past go away, he can learn to live with it. The story was directed in a way that blurs the line of James' sanity, and the plot is layered with so many brilliant moments of foreshadowing and details leading to the big twist that it makes replaying the game so rewarding. James killing Mary was an act of mercy, but it was also an act of selfishness. And when James recognizes that, the guilt broke him. Personally, I can't imagine an ending where James' guilt doesn't end up killing him. Like during the hallway memory before the final battle where he hears the second half of Mary's last words he didn't hear the first time. Now he would feel even worse for killing her. Mary still forgave him because she knew he didn't do it just because he hated her or because he didn't want to take care of her. One of the reasons he killed her was because he was tired of seeing her suffer. It's not as black and white as saying, oh, he just didn't want to take care of her anymore so he killed her. Killing Mary was something he clearly felt guilty over. Even in one of the endings, he's unable to move on from what he did. James is a victim of his own mind. His experience in Silent Hill was his own inner conflict, and the different endings demonstrate the different ways in which he copes with what happened. Realistically, Silent Hill doesn't really care if you break or fix yourself. The town is a force of nature that Alyssa and the cult twisted into its current state. It's more like a purgatory where James is stuck, reflecting the darkest aspects of his soul. The same can be said for the other people in Silent Hill, who practically live their own game, with their own monsters and symbolism. But James has another problem reflected in the game, in which he tries to make decisions for other people. He tried to help Eddie, but Eddie ignored him, and he later kills him to save his own life. He tries to help Angela, but she didn't want his help, because she already knows that he's incapable of helping her. This could mean that his actions don't necessarily reflect his intentions. In order to help another person, you have to understand them, and because James didn't, he couldn't help them. So he was actually the cause of his own sorrow by developing a savior complex. This is the lesson James had to learn, aside from accepting his sin. Sometimes bad things happen and there's nothing you can do about it. You have to accept it and move on. In life, we're not defined by the tragedies that befall us, but rather how we cope with them. This is part of the reason why there's no solid canonicity to the endings. These are just different ways that one deals with their trauma. We can succumb to it as in the Maria ending, seek atonement through punishing ourselves as in the Water ending, or we can simply leave and put the guilt behind us and move on. None of the endings are exactly happy. They range from bittersweet to truly depressing. But there's actually a stark beauty in that. In the Leave ending, we're given an honest depiction of healing. Not exactly happy, but hopeful. It's really no coincidence that this is the best James can hope for. It's also the best that many of us affected by trauma can hope for. And in the In Water ending, we see an ending that's all too common for those who are unable to heal from their pain. Drowning. The main message Silent Hill 2 teaches us is that dealing with loss and grief is never easy, and it's best to realize the truth before you damage yourself more. Silent Hill 2 isn't just a game, it's also a life lesson given to every individual player. In life we have to face our sins and past mistakes. We accept them, and then comes forgiveness and redemption. Silent Hill 2 is a work of art that we were really lucky to see in our lifetimes, and something we'll be lucky to ever see again. I really can't think of another game that could possibly match it in terms of story, characters, themes, and portrayal of its subject matter. To this day, it is by far one of the most, if not the most mature examination of grief, trauma, sexual abuse, suicide, and morality all combined. It's an intelligent game that doesn't hold anyone's hand, and comes at the player with utmost confidence in itself. It's a harsh, cold, unforgiving hell. A tale filled with pain, sorrow, and human desolation. But at the same time, it also represents hope and healing, overcoming the boundaries that are set for us and move forward. Silent Hill 2 is a game that truly understands people who suffer from physical and psychological trauma, and the way it uses James' story as a tool to demonstrate that is brilliant. Someone did call him to Silent Hill, and it turns out that someone was the town itself, dragging him through a hell that he couldn't escape from, taunting and pushing him further and further to his breaking point, until he finally decided to accept reality and defeat his inner demons, and also himself. I don't think there's been another AAA game since that's come close to its sensitivity in portraying mental illness and trauma. Nothing before or after has ever come close to how poetic, beautiful, and deep this game goes. This game was extraordinary, and what makes it work so well is not just the disturbing creatures, surreal atmosphere, or dreamlike narrative. It's the fact that this game is just a pure, absolute descent into the mind of not just James, but also the strange and disturbed people he meets. Everything is somehow related to his fears, emotions, and regrets. It's dark, disturbing, psychologically complex, surreal, and absolutely unforgettable. It's a haunting portrayal of psychological horror from the perspective of a grieving widow clinging to his last hope and memory of his wife. It's a true masterpiece and a symbolic work of art. Themes of loss, suffering, and depression are universally and beautifully constructed here. James' inner conflict screams that he created his own prison throughout the game, and only he can decide whether or not he's allowed to leave. I get that it's really gimmicky to make a review of this game right before the remake comes out, but I felt like it was important to revisit the world of Silent Hill 2 in anticipation of the remake. Regardless of how good or bad it ends up being, the simple fact is that the remake is trying to do something that's completely impossible to do. Silent Hill 2 can never be remade. There's simply nothing you can do to recapture the feeling of playing through this game. And that's why Silent Hill 2 is so beloved. Its uniqueness and how you can't simply recreate the feeling it left you with. They might be able to update the atmosphere, environments, combat, and voice acting, but nothing the remake does can ever match the spiritual impact the original had on gamers. It's truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and one that sticks with you even decades after the initial experience. It's truly the best survival horror game ever made, so it feels like the remake is unnecessary in that regard, trying to elevate something that can't be elevated, because it's already perfect in every single way. It left us feeling so many emotions, both positive and negative, accomplishing its task as a true work of art. It made us sad, and yet, at the same time, it made us happy. Thank you for watching my review of Silent Hill 2. I really appreciate that there's still people out there who value the work I do for media criticism.